Hey guys, welcome to the Quiet Past historical channel. Tonight we're settling in for a long one. Get comfortable, dim those lights, maybe grab a blanket, because we're about to spend the next few hours walking through the American Revolution. Not the action movie version with dramatic battle scenes and inspiring speeches, but the actual messy, complicated, surprisingly petty version where everyone was constantly exhausted, broke, and arguing with each other. This is going to be one of those stories where nobody really knew what they were doing at first. The British thought they'd just show up and remind everyone who was in charge. The colonists thought maybe they could just complain loud enough and things would change. Spoiler alert, it took 8 years, thousands of deaths, and so much paperwork that you'd think they were inventing bureaucracy itself. We're going to meet King George III, who gets a lot of blame, but was honestly just stubborn and surrounded by terrible advisors. We'll hang out with George Washington, who spent most of the war stressed out of his mind, trying to keep an army together, with no money and soldiers who kept going home whenever they felt like it. We'll watch Benjamin Franklin charm the French into bankrupting themselves for America's cause. And we'll see how a bunch of colonial farmers, merchants, and lawyers accidentally created a new country while arguing about literally everything. So let's float back to the 1760s, when America was still just a collection of British colonies, and nobody was really thinking about independence yet. They were mostly thinking about taxes, because of course they were. The thing you have to understand about the American Revolution is that it didn't start as a revolution at all. It started as a very long, very annoying argument about money. The British had just finished fighting the 7 Years' War, which Americans called the French and Indian War, because apparently they couldn't agree on names even back then. Britain won, which was great. They got a bunch of new territory in North America, but winning wars is expensive, and Britain was broke. So Parliament looked at all these American colonies and thought, hey, we just spent a fortune defending these people from the French. Maybe they should help pay for it. Seems reasonable, right? The colonists did not think it was reasonable. They had their own very strong opinions about who should pay for what, and those opinions mostly involved not them. In 1765, Britain passed the Stamp Act. This required colonists to buy special stamped paper for legal documents, newspapers, playing cards, basically anything official. It wasn't even that much money, but the colonists lost their minds over it. Not because of the cost, really, but because Parliament had passed a tax without asking the colonial assemblies first. No taxation without representation, they said, which would have been a more compelling argument if they'd actually wanted representation in Parliament, but most of them didn't. They just didn't want to be taxed. The protests got intense. There were riots in Boston. Tax collectors got threatened, their houses vandalized. Groups calling themselves the Sons of Liberty started organizing resistance. In New York, they burned the lieutenant governor in effigy, which seems a bit dramatic for a stamp tax, but emotions were running high. Parliament eventually repealed the Stamp Act in 1766, probably thinking that would be the end of it. It was not the end of it. Parliament immediately passed the Declaratory Act, which basically said, "We're repealing this tax, but just so we're clear, we totally have the right to tax you whenever we want." The colonists ignored this because they'd won, sort of, and maybe everyone would just move on now. They did not move on. In 1767, Parliament passed the Townshend Acts, named after Charles Townshend, who was the Chancellor of the Exchequer and thought he'd found a clever loophole. The colonists had objected to internal taxes like the Stamp Act, so he'd just impose external taxes on imports instead. Taxes on glass, lead, paint, paper, and tea. Surely they couldn't object to that. They absolutely objected to that. The colonists responded with boycotts. Women's groups organized to produce homespun cloth instead of buying British fabric. People stopped drinking British tea and switched to coffee or smuggled Dutch tea. Merchants agreed not to import British goods. It was very organized and very annoying for British merchants, who started lobbying Parliament to repeal the taxes. Meanwhile, tensions were rising in Boston, which was becoming the center of colonial resistance, because Bostonians have always been like that. The British sent troops to Boston in 1768 to keep order, which the colonists saw as an occupation army. The soldiers saw it as a miserable posting where everyone hated them. Both were correct. The soldiers weren't paid well and were allowed to take side jobs, which meant they competed with local workers for employment. People got into fights. There were insults, shoving matches, growing resentment on both sides. It was an incredibly tense situation, just waiting for something to go wrong. On March 5, 1770, something went wrong. It started with a wigmaker's apprentice insulting a British officer about an unpaid bill. A soldier hit the kid. A crowd gathered because colonial Bostonians apparently had nothing better to do than gather into angry mobs. They started throwing snowballs at the soldiers, then ice, then rocks hidden in snowballs. More soldiers arrived. The crowd grew larger and angrier. Someone rang a church bell, which was the alarm for fire, so even more people showed up thinking there was an emergency. The soldiers were surrounded by hundreds of hostile colonists. People were shouting, throwing things, daring the soldiers to fire. One soldier got hit with a club and went down. In the chaos and confusion, the soldiers fired into the crowd. 5 colonists died, 6 were wounded. The colonial press called it the Boston Massacre, which made it sound like a planned slaughter instead of a panicked response to a mob. Paul Revere made an engraving showing the soldiers as executioners calmly murdering innocent citizens, which was great propaganda, but terrible history. The soldiers were put on trial, and John Adams, who would later be a revolutionary leader and president, defended them because he believed in the rule of law. Most of them were acquitted. 2 were found guilty of manslaughter, branded on the thumb, and discharged from the army. The interesting thing is that after the Boston Massacre, things actually calmed down for a while. Parliament repealed most of the Townshend Acts, keeping only the tax on tea because they wanted to make a point about their right to tax the colonies. colonists mostly went back to their lives. The boycotts faded. Trade resumed. For a couple of years, it looked like maybe everyone would just forget about the whole thing. But that tea tax was still there, sitting like a splinter that nobody wanted to address directly, but everyone could feel. Let's talk about King George III for a minute, because he gets cast as the villain in the American story. And honestly, he wasn't great. But he was also more complicated than that. George became king in 1760 at age 22. He was the first Hanoverian king born in England and raised speaking English as his first language, which sounds like a low bar, but his two predecessors had been very German and not particularly interested in England. George took his job seriously. Too seriously, probably. He had very firm ideas about royal authority and the proper order of things. He was stubborn, moralistic, and absolutely convinced that he was right about everything. He also had terrible luck with advisors and kept picking ministers who gave him bad advice, which he followed because it confirmed what he already believed. In the early 1770s, George was still relatively young and hadn't yet started showing the signs of the illness that would later make him incapable of ruling. He was a devoted husband, a loving father, deeply religious, personally moral, in a way that was actually unusual for royalty at the time. He didn't keep mistresses. He didn't gamble excessively. He was interested in agriculture and science. By the standards of 18th century monarchs, he was practically boring. But he was absolutely rigid on the question of Parliament's authority over the colonies. To George, this wasn't really about tea or taxes. It was about whether the colonists would acknowledge that Parliament had supreme authority. If they didn't, if they could just ignore laws they didn't like, then what was the point of having an empire? From his perspective, letting the colonists defy Parliament was the first step toward chaos and the dissolution of everything he'd been raised to protect. The colonists, naturally, saw things very differently. They considered themselves loyal British subjects with all the rights of Englishmen. But those rights, they argued, included not being taxed by a parliament where they had no representation. They had their own colonial assemblies that had always managed their internal affairs. Parliament could regulate trade, sure, but imposing taxes was different. That was internal legislation, and that should be up to their own assemblies. It was a fundamental disagreement about how the empire should work, and neither side was willing to compromise because both sides thought they were defending essential principles. Which is how you get a war that probably could have been avoided if anyone had been willing to back down even a little bit. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. In 1773, everyone was still trying to pretend the problem would solve itself. The East India Company was in trouble. This massive British corporation that essentially ran India and controlled much of Britain's trade with Asia was on the verge of bankruptcy. They had warehouses full of tea they couldn't sell because of various complicated financial issues. The British government, worried about the company's collapse, decided to help them out by passing the Tea Act in 1773. The Tea Act actually lowered the price of tea for colonists. It let the East India Company sell directly to the colonies without the usual middlemen, which made tea cheaper even with the townshend tax still attached. The British government thought this was brilliant. They'd help the East India Company, the colonists would get cheaper tea, and everyone would accept Parliament's right to tax. Win, win, win. The colonists were not impressed. First, the lower price would undercut the colonial merchants who had been smuggling Dutch tea, which was a significant business. Second, and more importantly, it was seen as a trick to get colonists to accept the principle of Parliament's right to tax them. Buy the cheap tea, and you're implicitly accepting the tax. It was a trap, the colonial radical said. Don't fall for it. When ships loaded with East India Company tea started arriving in colonial ports, protesters organized to turn them away. In New York and Philadelphia, the ships never even unloaded. In Charleston, the tea was locked up in a warehouse and forgotten about. But in Boston, Governor Thomas Hutchinson decided to make a stand. The tea would be unloaded. The tax would be paid. The law would be followed. The Boston Sons of Liberty had other ideas. On the night of December 16, 1773, somewhere between 30 and 130 men, some disguised as Mohawk Indians, because that made it a political statement instead of just vandalism apparently, boarded 3 ships in Boston Harbor. Over the course of 3 hours, they systematically opened 342 chests of tea and dumped them into the water. They were very organized about it. They didn't steal anything. They didn't damage the ships beyond breaking open the tea chests. When they were done, they swept the decks and left. The next morning, Boston Harbor was full of tea. Someone calculated that the value of the destroyed tea was around 9,000 pounds, which was an enormous sum. In today's money, it would be over $1 million. The British government was furious. Parliament responded with what the colonists called the Intolerable Acts, and the British called the Coercive Acts, because naming things was still a problem. These were a series of laws designed to punish Massachusetts and make an example of Boston. The port of Boston was closed until the tea was paid for. The Massachusetts Charter was essentially revoked, giving the royal governor much more power. British officials accused of crimes in Massachusetts would be tried in Britain. The Quartering Act was expanded, requiring colonists to house British soldiers. The British thought this would isolate Massachusetts and show the other colonies what happened when you defied Parliament. Instead, the other colonies rallied to support Massachusetts. They saw the Intolerable Acts as evidence that Parliament would strip away their rights too if they didn't stand together. Colonial assemblies started sending supplies to Boston, and they started talking about meeting together to coordinate a response. In September 1774, delegates from 12 colonies met in Philadelphia for the First Continental Congress. Georgia didn't send anyone because Georgia was weird and had its own issues. The delegates were not revolutionaries at this point. Most of them still considered themselves loyal British subjects who just wanted their grievances addressed. They sent a petition to King George asking him to intervene and protect their rights. They organized a continental boycott of British goods. They agreed to meet again in May 1775 if things hadn't improved. Things did not improve. King George, getting his information filtered through ministers who assured him that this was just a small radical minority, and the loyal majority would support the crown once Britain showed strength, declared Massachusetts in rebellion. He started sending more troops. He approved measures to restrict colonial trade. He was done negotiating with people he saw as ungrateful subjects who refused to acknowledge proper authority. The colonists, watching British troops arrive and their political autonomy being stripped away, started organizing militias and stockpiling weapons. Not because they wanted war, most of them insisted, but because they needed to be ready to defend their rights if it came to that. By the spring of 1775, Massachusetts was an armed camp. British troops occupied Boston. Colonial militias drilled on town greens. Both sides were watching each other nervously, and everyone was trying to convince themselves that surely it wouldn't actually come to violence. Surely someone would back down. Surely there was still a peaceful solution. There wasn't. The shot heard round the world, and then years of confusion. General Thomas Gage was having a terrible time. He was the British military governor of Massachusetts, which in early 1775 meant he was responsible for keeping order in a province that absolutely did not want to be kept in order. He had about 3,000 troops in Boston, which sounds like a lot until you realize they were surrounded by thousands of increasingly hostile and well-armed colonists. Gage had intelligence that the colonial militia was stockpiling weapons and ammunition in Concord, about 20 miles from Boston. He decided to send a force to confiscate these supplies. It was supposed to be a quick, quiet operation. Get in, seize the weapons, get out before the colonists could organize a response. Simple. It was not simple. On the night of April 18, 1775, Gage ordered about 700 soldiers to march to Concord. The soldiers tried to keep it quiet, but Boston was full of colonial spies who noticed when 700 soldiers suddenly assembled and started marching out of town. Paul Revere and William Dawes were sent to warn the countryside that the British were coming. Paul Revere gets all the credit thanks to a Longfellow poem written decades later, but he didn't actually finish the ride. He made it to Lexington and warned Samuel Adams and John Hancock that British troops were on the way. But then he got captured by a British patrol. He talked his way out of it eventually, but he never made it to Concord. Other riders spread the warning. By dawn, the militia was assembling. The British troops reached Lexington around dawn on April 19. About 70 colonial militiamen were gathered on the town green under Captain John Parker, facing 700 British soldiers. This was not a fight they could win, and Parker apparently told his men to let the British pass. Some accounts say he told them not to fire unless fired upon. Others say he told them to disperse. What he definitely didn't tell them to do was start a war. What happened next is confused because it was dawn. Everyone was nervous, and nobody expected shots to be fired. Someone fired. Maybe a Colonial militia member. Maybe a British soldier. Maybe someone who wasn't even part of either formation. It doesn't really matter who fired first, because once one shot went off, everyone started shooting. The British soldiers fired volleys into the militia. 8 colonists died. 10 were wounded. The militia scattered. The British officers got their men back under control and continued marching to Concord. The whole confrontation took maybe 15 minutes. If you were keeping score, it was a decisive British victory. The British reached Concord a few hours later and started searching for weapons. They found some supplies and destroyed them. But by now, militia from all over the area were converging on Concord. Hundreds of armed men were taking positions around the town. The British started to realize they might be in trouble. At the North Bridge outside Concord, British soldiers confronted a force of about 400 militia. This time, the colonists fired first, and the British returned fire. 3 British soldiers were killed, 9 wounded. The British retreated back into town, where their commander decided that maybe it was time to head back to Boston before things got worse. The march back was a nightmare. Colonial militia lined the roads, firing from behind trees, walls, and buildings. The British soldiers were trained for European-style warfare, where armies faced each other in open fields. This was something completely different. They couldn't see most of their attackers. They couldn't form proper lines. They just had to keep marching while militia kept shooting at them. By the time they reached Charlestown, near Boston, the British had lost 73 killed, 174 wounded, and 53 missing. Colonial casualties were 49 killed, 39 wounded, 5 missing. It was a humiliating defeat for professional soldiers who should have been able to handle a bunch of farmers with muskets. News of the battles spread through the colonies faster than anyone expected. Thousands of militia members from across New England started marching toward Boston. Within days, Boston was under siege, surrounded by an improvised colonial army that nobody was quite sure who was in command of or what they were supposed to do next. The Second Continental Congress met in Philadelphia in May 1775, and suddenly they weren't just debating trade policy anymore. There was an actual shooting war happening in Massachusetts. They needed to do something. But what? They still weren't ready to declare independence. Most delegates still hoped for reconciliation with Britain, but they also needed to support Massachusetts and organize some kind of response to British military action. So they did what seemed like the most reasonable compromise. They adopted the militia army besieging Boston as the Continental Army, gave it some legitimacy and structure, and appointed George Washington as its commander. Washington was not the obvious choice. He wasn't from Massachusetts, which was actually a point in his favor because the other colonies didn't want this to be just a Massachusetts problem. He was from Virginia, the largest and most influential Southern colony. He had military experience from the French and Indian War. He was tall, looked impressive in uniform, and carried himself with natural authority. He was also one of the richest men in America and could potentially help fund the army out of his own pocket if necessary. On June 15, 1775, Congress appointed Washington commander-in-chief of the Continental Army. He accepted with apparent reluctance, insisting he wasn't qualified and refusing to take a salary beyond expenses. This made him seem selfless and noble, which was good for his image. It also meant he could claim whatever expenses he wanted, which added up to quite a lot over the course of the war. But that's a different issue. Washington left Philadelphia for Massachusetts to take command of his new army. He was about to discover just how much of a disaster it actually was. Before Washington even arrived in Massachusetts, the colonists and British fought another major battle, and it was even more brutal than Lexington and Concord. After April 19, the colonial forces had surrounded Boston, but they didn't have a unified command structure yet. Different militia units were under different commanders with different ideas about what to do. The British held Boston, but were effectively trapped there. Neither side was sure what came next. In mid-June, colonial commanders learned that the British were planning to fortify the hills around Boston to break the siege. They decided to fortify Bunker Hill on the Charlestown Peninsula first. Then, someone decided Breed's Hill was actually better because it was closer to Boston. So that's where they built their fortifications instead. This would cause confusion for centuries because the battle that followed would be called the Battle of Bunker Hill, even though it happened on Breed's Hill. On the night of June 16, 1775, colonial forces built a redoubt on Breed's Hill. The British woke up the next morning to find a fortification that definitely hadn't been there the day before, positioned where it could threaten their ships and positions. They were not pleased. General William Howe, who would soon replace Gage as the British commander, led about 2,200 soldiers in an assault on the colonial position. The plan was straightforward. March up the hill, break through the fortifications, destroy the rebel position. British soldiers had done this sort of thing successfully all over the world. There was no reason it shouldn't work here, except the colonists had learned a few things. They were behind fortifications. They had a good defensive position. And their commanders, knowing they didn't have much ammunition, told them not to fire until they could see the whites of the British eyes. This is probably the most famous order from the battle, though nobody's sure who actually said it first. It was good advice, though. Wait until the enemy is close. Make every shot count. The British advanced in perfect formation, looking magnificent in their red coats, and carrying full packs that weighed about 80 pounds each because someone decided the soldiers should carry all their equipment into battle. As they got close to the colonial lines, the colonists opened fire. The British front ranks were shattered. Soldiers fell everywhere. The survivors retreated to regroup. Howe ordered a second assault. The same thing happened. Perfect British formations, devastating colonial fire, heavy British casualties, retreat. For a third assault, the British finally dropped their packs and fixed bayonets. This time they made it to the fortifications. The colonists, running out of ammunition, couldn't maintain their fire. The British broke through the line. The colonists retreated, fighting hand to hand as they fell back. The British won the battle, taking the hill and driving the colonists off the peninsula. But it cost them 226 killed and over 800 wounded out of 2,200 men engaged. That's a 45% casualty rate. Officers were hit particularly hard because the colonists, not being gentlemen, specifically targeted the officers. The colonists lost about 140 killed and 270 wounded. General Clinton, another British commander, supposedly said, "A few more such victories would have shortly put an end to British dominion in America." He was right. The British couldn't afford many victories like that, and the colonists had proven they could stand against professional soldiers, at least from behind good fortifications. When Washington arrived at Cambridge in early July to take command of the Continental Army, he found a mess. About 14,000 to 16,000 men were camped around Boston in what could very generously be called an army. They had different uniforms, or no uniforms. They had different weapons. They had different levels of training, ranging from minimal to none. They were organized into companies and regiments from different colonies that didn't necessarily want to take orders from anyone outside their own command structure. Many of the soldiers had elected their own officers, which sounds democratic, but meant that officers couldn't discipline their men without risking being voted out. Soldiers wandered off whenever they wanted. They ignored orders they disagreed with. They lived in terrible camps with minimal sanitation. Disease was spreading. Supplies were inadequate. There was no real chain of command. Nobody was quite sure how long anyone was supposed to serve or who was responsible for paying them. Washington looked at this situation and probably wanted to get back on his horse and ride back to Virginia. But he was committed now. He started trying to turn this mob into an army, which would turn out to be one of the hardest things he ever did. He imposed discipline, which the soldiers resented. He insisted on proper military hierarchy, which the democratic-minded New Englanders thought was very elitist of him. He tried to integrate soldiers from different colonies into unified formations, which everyone resisted because they wanted to stay with their neighbors. He dealt with constant supply problems, funding problems, desertion problems, and the fact that most of his soldiers' enlistments would expire at the end of the year. So he'd have to rebuild the entire army from scratch in a few months. And he had to figure out what to do about Boston, where the British Army sat in a city that the colonists wanted back, but nobody was quite sure how to get them out of. Independence, sort of, while Washington was trying to create an army out of nothing around Boston. The Continental Congress was trying to figure out what they were actually fighting for. Most delegates still weren't ready to declare independence. They'd spent their whole lives thinking of themselves as British subjects. Breaking away from Britain was radical, frightening, and would make them traitors if they lost. But they also weren't willing to just submit to Parliament's authority. So they were stuck in this weird position of being at war with Britain while simultaneously insisting they were loyal to the king and just wanted their rights as Englishmen respected. King George III made this position harder to maintain when, in August 1775, he declared the colonies in open rebellion and called for suppressing the revolt. Then, in October, he announced he was hiring German mercenaries to help put down the rebellion. This did not help convince colonists that peaceful reconciliation was possible. In January 1776, Thomas Paine published Common Sense, which was basically a long pamphlet explaining why America should absolutely declare independence and stop pretending reconciliation was possible. It was written in clear, direct language that ordinary people could understand, not the formal political philosophy style that educated men used. It became a massive bestseller, selling something like 120,000 copies in the first 3 months. The colonial population was only about 2.5 million, so that's proportionally like selling tens of millions of copies today. Paine argued that it was ridiculous for a continent to be governed by an island. That monarchy was a stupid system, that Britain had dragged America into its European wars for no good reason. That independence wasn't just possible, but inevitable. He made the case emotionally and logically, and he convinced a lot of people. Meanwhile, Washington was still stuck outside Boston, and by March 1776, he was getting frustrated. His army had been sitting there for nearly a year. He needed to do something. He finally got his chance when Colonel Henry Knox arrived with artillery that he'd somehow dragged all the way from Fort Ticonderoga in New York. About 60 tons of cannons hauled across hundreds of miles in the middle of winter. It was an impressive feat. Washington had his men fortify Dorchester Heights overnight on March 4, 1776, placing the captured artillery where it could bombard Boston and the British ships in the harbor. The British woke up to find American cannons looking down at them in a situation that was becoming very familiar and very annoying. General Howe, now in command of British forces, considered attacking the heights, but decided it wasn't worth another Bunker Hill situation. Instead, he evacuated Boston. On March 17, the British fleet sailed away, taking about 9,000 soldiers and over 1,000 loyalists who didn't want to stay in a city controlled by the rebels. Washington marched into Boston in triumph without having to fight a battle. It was his first major success as commander. The British headed to Halifax, Nova Scotia, to regroup and plan their next move. Washington, correctly guessing they'd target New York next, because controlling New York would cut New England off from the other colonies, marched his army south to defend the city. Back in Philadelphia, Congress was edging closer to declaring independence. More delegates were coming around to the idea. The war was expanding. It was getting harder to claim they were just defending their rights while actively fighting the British Army. And practical considerations mattered too. If they were going to get foreign support, particularly from France, they needed to declare themselves an actual independent nation, not just rebellious British subjects. On June 7, 1776, Richard Henry Lee of Virginia proposed a resolution that these united colonies are, and of right ought to be, free and independent states. Congress debated for weeks. Some delegations still weren't authorized to vote for independence. Some delegates still hoped for reconciliation, but the momentum was building. Congress appointed a committee to draft a declaration in case the independence resolution passed. The committee included John Adams, Benjamin Franklin, Thomas Jefferson, Roger Sherman, and Robert Livingston. They delegated the actual writing to Jefferson, who was known for his writing skills and had less annoying personality quirks than Adams. Jefferson wrote a draft. The committee revised it. Congress revised it more, cutting about a quarter of Jefferson's text, including a long section blaming King George for the slave trade, which the Southern delegates wouldn't accept. What emerged was a document that tried to explain why the colonies were breaking away, justify it philosophically, and list all the grievances against the king that made independence necessary. On July 2, 1776, Congress voted to approve Lee's resolution. 12 colonies voted yes. New York abstained because their delegation wasn't authorized to vote yet. Independence was officially declared, though nobody would remember July 2 as the important date. On July 4, Congress approved the final text of the Declaration of Independence. This is the date everyone would remember, even though the actual vote for independence was 2 days earlier. The Declaration was printed and distributed. It was read aloud in public ceremonies. It was sent to Washington's army, where it was read to the troops to explain what they were fighting for. The Declaration is famous for its opening. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, which was beautiful and inspiring, and also deeply hypocritical given that many of the men who signed it, including Jefferson himself, owned slaves. But let's float on from that particular complication for now. The Declaration listed 27 grievances against King George III, blaming him personally for everything wrong with British policy toward the colonies. This was partly because it was easier to target a person than an abstract institution, and partly because the colonists still wanted to believe Parliament had been misled and the king was responsible. Either way, it was now official. The colonies were declaring themselves independent states. They would sink or swim together. When the news reached King George, he was not impressed. These were rebels, traitors, criminals. They would be defeated and punished. He was absolutely certain of this. He just needed to send enough troops. When the news reached General Howe and the British forces, they were also unimpressed. The British had the most powerful military in the world. These colonial rebels had an improvised army with questionable training, inadequate supplies, and no real navy to speak of. This would be handled quickly once Britain committed sufficient resources. The Declaration changed nothing materially. It just made clear that this would end with the rebel leaders being hanged for treason rather than just punished and sent home. Washington received the news while preparing to defend New York. He had his troops assembled and had the declaration read to them. Then he went back to trying to figure out how to defend a city against a vastly superior military force. Because declaring independence was one thing, achieving it was going to be much harder. The defense of New York in the summer of 1776 was a complete disaster for the Continental Army, and it taught Washington some very painful lessons about what his army could and couldn't do. New York was almost impossible to defend. It was surrounded by water, which meant the British Navy could move troops wherever they wanted. The British had 32,000 soldiers and 10,000 sailors. Washington had about 19,000 soldiers, most of them poorly trained militia. The British had experienced generals and professional soldiers. Washington had enthusiasm and not much else. General Howe landed his forces on Staten Island and took his time preparing for the assault. He had numerical superiority, professional troops, and a battle plan. There was no rush. In late August, Howe landed forces on Long Island and attacked the American positions. The Battle of Long Island was the largest battle of the entire war, and it went badly for the Americans. Howe outmaneuvered Washington, using a flanking move that caught the Americans by surprise. About 2,000 American soldiers were killed, wounded, or captured. The survivors retreated to fortifications on Brooklyn Heights, trapped with their backs to the East River. Howe could have finished the job right there. He had the Americans surrounded and outnumbered. But he was cautious, probably remembering what happened at Bunker Hill when he'd assaulted fortified positions. He decided to besiege the position instead, slowly advancing his lines until he could force a surrender. This gave Washington a chance to escape. On the night of August 29, using fog and darkness as cover, Washington evacuated his entire army across the East River to Manhattan. About 9,000 soldiers and all their supplies crossed the river in small boats, while the British didn't realize what was happening. It was a remarkable achievement, and probably saved the Continental Army from destruction. But it was still a retreat from a significant defeat. Washington tried to defend Manhattan, but the British kept landing forces at different points, threatening to surround and cut off American units. There were several more skirmishes and small battles. The Americans kept retreating. In mid-September, the British occupied New York City, which they would hold for the rest of the war. In mid-October, the British pushed north and mauled the American army again at White Plains. In November, the British captured Fort Washington on Manhattan, taking about 3,000 American prisoners. A few days later, they captured Fort Lee in New Jersey. By late November, Washington's army was in full retreat across New Jersey, heading for Pennsylvania. His army was falling apart. Soldiers' enlistments were expiring, and men were going home. Others were deserting. He'd started with about 19,000 men and was down to maybe 3,000. The British were pursuing, and Washington couldn't afford to stop and fight because his army would be destroyed. Thomas Paine, who had joined the army as a volunteer, wrote another pamphlet during the retreat. "These are the times that try men's souls," it began. "The summer soldier and the sunshine patriot will, in this crisis, shrink from the service of their country. But he that stands by it now deserves the love and thanks of man and woman." It was inspiring. It also acknowledged how dire the situation was. The cause of independence, which had seemed so promising in July, looked like it might collapse before the year ended. Washington crossed the Delaware River into Pennsylvania on December 8, taking every boat he could find to prevent the British from following immediately. The British decided to pause their pursuit and establish winter quarters in New Jersey. They occupied several towns, including Trenton, which was garrisoned by about 1,500 Hessian soldiers. The Hessians were German troops that King George had hired to supplement British forces. They were professionals, well-trained and experienced, but they were also mercenaries far from home, and they didn't particularly care about the conflict they were fighting in. They were just doing a job. Washington looked at his shrinking, demoralized army and realized he needed a victory. Something to show that the cause wasn't lost, that the Continental Army could win battles, that independence was still possible. His soldiers' enlistments would expire at the end of December. If they went home, he'd have almost nothing left. He needed to do something dramatic before it was too late. So he decided to attack Trenton on Christmas night, when the Hessians would be least prepared. Crossing the Delaware and other desperate measures, the plan to attack Trenton was either brilliant or insane, depending on whether it worked. Washington would split his army into 3 groups, each crossing the Delaware River at different points. They'd attack Trenton simultaneously from different directions, overwhelming the Hessian garrison before they could organize a defense. It required precise timing, surprise, and luck. Everything had to go right, which in Washington's experience so far, nothing ever did. On Christmas night, 1776, Washington assembled about 2,400 men to cross the Delaware, about 9 miles north of Trenton. The other 2 groups never managed to cross. The river was full of ice floes, the weather was terrible, and coordinating 3 separate forces was beyond the Continental Army's capabilities. But Washington's group made it across, and they didn't know the others had failed, so they proceeded with the attack. The march to Trenton took hours in freezing rain and sleet. 2 soldiers froze to death during the march. Many didn't have proper shoes and left bloody footprints in the snow. But they reached Trenton at about 8 a.m. on December 26 and attacked. The Hessians were surprised, not because they were drunk from Christmas celebrations, which is the popular myth, but because they didn't think the Continental Army was capable of mounting an offensive in the middle of winter. They'd been doing patrols and were aware of American forces in the area, but they didn't expect a full-scale attack. The battle lasted about an hour. The Hessians tried to organize a defense, but were overwhelmed. Their commander, Colonel Johann Rall, was mortally wounded. About 22 Hessians were killed and 83 wounded. Around 900 were captured. American casualties were 2 killed and 5 wounded, though those numbers don't include the soldiers who died from exposure on the march. It was a small battle, but it was a complete American victory at a time when victories were desperately needed. Washington recrossed the Delaware with his prisoners and captured supplies. And suddenly, the Continental Army had hope again. The British weren't invincible. The war wasn't over. Congress was so encouraged that they gave Washington expanded powers for 6 months. He could raise new troops, appoint officers, and requisition supplies without waiting for congressional approval. This was necessary because Congress was slow and bureaucratic, but it also meant Washington had near dictatorial powers, which made some people nervous. Washington, to his credit, never abused these powers and gave them up when the 6 months ended. The British, meanwhile, were embarrassed and angry. General Cornwallis, who had been about to sail home to England, was ordered to New Jersey to deal with Washington's army. He assembled about 8,000 soldiers and marched toward Trenton in early January. Washington, reinforced by militia, and with some of his soldiers convinced to extend their enlistments for a month by promises of bonus pay, had about 5,000 men. He took up a defensive position south of Trenton, across the Assunpink Creek. On January 2, 1777, Cornwallis attacked 3 times, and 3 times the Americans held. As night fell, Cornwallis decided to wait until morning to finish the job. "We've got the old fox now," he reportedly said, confident that Washington was trapped. Washington, hearing himself called an old fox, probably felt old, but was determined not to be trapped. That night, leaving campfires burning and soldiers making noise to convince the British they were still there, Washington marched his army around the British position. By dawn, they were attacking Princeton, another British garrison. The Battle of Princeton was confused and close fought. An American general, Hugh Merrifield, was killed. At one point, Washington personally led a charge, riding between his men and the British at about 30 yards distance. His aides thought he'd be killed for sure, but somehow he wasn't hit. The British defenders eventually broke and retreated. Washington won another victory. Then, rather than pushing his luck further, Washington moved his army into winter quarters at Morristown, New Jersey, in a defensible position in the hills where the British couldn't easily attack. The winter campaign was over. Washington had saved his army and the cause of independence when both had been on the verge of collapse. The British, frustrated and embarrassed, pulled most of their forces back to New York. They still held New York City and would for the rest of the war, but the easy victory they'd expected hadn't materialized. This was going to take longer than anyone thought. Let's drift over to what was happening politically while all these battles were being fought. Because the new United States, if we can call it that, needed some kind of government. The Continental Congress was still meeting in Philadelphia, trying to run a war, manage foreign relations, oversee finances, and create a system of government, all while having no real authority beyond what the individual states were willing to give them. Congress could pass resolutions and make requests, But it couldn't tax, couldn't enforce laws, couldn't compel states to do anything. In 1776 and 1777, Congress debated what would become the Articles of Confederation, which was an attempt to create a formal framework for how the states would work together. The Articles gave almost all power to the states and very little to the central government. Congress could conduct foreign relations, declare war, manage relations with Native Americans, and operate a postal system, but it couldn't tax, couldn't regulate commerce between states, and needed the approval of 9 out of 13 states to pass most significant legislation. The Articles wouldn't be ratified until 1781 because states kept arguing about various provisions, particularly about who controlled Western land claims. Maryland refused to ratify until the states with Western land claims agreed to cede them to the national government. This took years to resolve. So through most of the Revolutionary War, the United States didn't even have a formally ratified system of government. Congress just kind of operated and hoped the states would cooperate. Congress's biggest problem was money. Wars are expensive. Soldiers need to be paid, supplied, fed, and equipped. But Congress couldn't tax. It could only request money from the states, who sometimes sent funds and sometimes didn't. Congress tried printing money, which led to inflation so bad that "not worth a continental" became a phrase for something worthless. They borrowed money from foreign governments and rich individuals. They issued certificates promising future payment. They improvised constantly and never had enough. Washington spent much of the war begging Congress for supplies, money, and reinforcements. Congress spent much of the war explaining that they'd love to help, but didn't have the resources. It was frustrating for everyone involved. The states themselves were going through their own political transformations. Most wrote new state constitutions, rejecting their old colonial charters. These constitutions varied widely. Pennsylvania's was radically democratic, with a single-house legislature and a weak executive. Massachusetts had a more balanced system with checks on popular power. All of them struggled with the same questions. How much democracy was appropriate? Who should have the right to vote? How much power should government have? These were theoretical questions being answered in real time by people who were also trying to survive a war. It was chaotic and messy, but it was also remarkable that they were attempting to build new governments based on principles of representation and popular sovereignty, while simultaneously fighting for survival. Meanwhile, the British were dealing with their own political complications. Parliament was divided on the war. The Whig opposition argued that the war was a mistake, that concessions should have been made, that forcing the colonists into submission was both morally wrong and strategically foolish. The government, controlled by Lord North's administration, with King George's support, insisted that the war was necessary to maintain British authority, and that victory was possible if they just committed sufficient resources. The British sent more troops, hired more Hessians, and prepared for a campaign in 1777 that they hoped would finally crush the rebellion. plan was to cut New England off from the rest of the states by controlling the Hudson River Valley. General Bergen would march south from Canada. Another force would march east from Lake Ontario. Howe would march north from New York. They'd meet at Albany, control the Hudson, isolate New England, and the rebellion would collapse. It was a good plan on paper. In practice, it required more coordination than 18th century communications could manage, and it dramatically underestimated how difficult it was to march armies through the American wilderness. While the British prepared their 1777 campaign, both armies spent the early months of the year in winter quarters, drilling, recruiting, and trying to stay alive in inadequate conditions. Washington's army at Morristown suffered through cold, supply shortages, and disease. Soldiers deserted regularly. Officers resigned. Washington dealt with constant problems and kept begging Congress for help. In the spring, General Howe finally moved, but not north toward Albany as the plan required. Instead, he decided to capture Philadelphia, the rebel capital. His reasoning was that taking Philadelphia would demoralize the rebels and possibly end the war. Also, Philadelphia was a comfortable city, and spending another year in the field chasing Washington's army around New Jersey didn't appeal to him. Howe embarked his army on ships and sailed south, entering the Chesapeake Bay and landing near Philadelphia in late August. Washington, who had been expecting Howe to march north, hurried south to defend the capital. On September 11, 1777, Washington tried to block Howe's advance at Brandywine Creek. The British again outmaneuvered the Americans, flanking Washington's position and forcing a retreat. It wasn't as disastrous as Long Island, but it was another defeat. Washington's army retreated in relatively good order, but they couldn't stop the British advance. On September 26, Howe occupied Philadelphia. Congress fled to York, Pennsylvania. The British had captured the rebel capital, which should have been significant, but actually didn't matter much because Congress could meet anywhere. Still, it was embarrassing for the Americans and looked good for British morale. Washington tried to counterattack on October 4 at Germantown, just outside Philadelphia. The plan was complex, involving multiple columns attacking simultaneously, which had never worked before for the Continental Army and didn't work this time either. The attack initially surprised the British, but American forces got confused in the fog, started shooting at each other, and ended up retreating. It was another defeat, though it had been close enough to show that the Continental Army was improving. So by mid-October 1777, the strategic situation looked good for Britain. They held New York City. They'd just captured Philadelphia. They defeated Washington in 2 major battles. In New York, the campaign to control the Hudson River Valley was about to reach its conclusion. Everything seemed to be going Britain's way, except things were going terribly wrong in New York. General John Bergen, known as Gentleman Johnny for his refined manners and love of luxury, had marched south from Canada in June 1777 with about 8,000 soldiers, including British regulars, Hessians, Canadians, Loyalists, and Native American allies. His plan was to march down Lake Champlain, capture Fort Ticonderoga, and then proceed down the Hudson River Valley to Albany. The early part went well. Bergen captured Fort Ticonderoga in July, which was supposed to be a strong American fortress, but which the Americans abandoned when they realized it couldn't be defended against the force Bergen brought. This seemed like a good sign. Then things got complicated. The terrain between Lake Champlain and the Hudson was difficult. Dense forests, rough ground, few roads. The American forces, under General Horatio Gates, had blocked the roads and destroyed bridges. Bergen's army was slowed to a crawl, covering maybe a mile a day through some stretches. Bergen had brought a massive supply train because he liked to campaign in comfort. There were carts full of personal baggage, including his own wine and fine dinners. This supply train slowed him down even more. His Native American allies, frustrated with the slow pace and Bergen's attempts to restrict their raids on civilians, started leaving. His army was getting smaller, while the American forces were growing as militia from across New England gathered to oppose him. In mid-August, Bergen sent a detachment to raid Bennington, Vermont, to capture supplies and horses. Instead, they ran into a large force of New Hampshire and Vermont militia, who destroyed the detachment, killing or capturing most of them. It was a significant loss and further delayed Bergen's advance. Meanwhile, the other parts of the plan were falling apart. The force that was supposed to march east from Lake Ontario had been stopped by American resistance and turned back. General Howe was in Philadelphia instead of marching up the Hudson to meet Bergen. Bergen was on his own, deep in hostile territory, with dwindling supplies and growing American forces gathering against him. By September, Bergen had crossed the Hudson and was approaching Saratoga, New York. The American army, now numbering around 11,000 men, was in a fortified position blocking his advance. Bergen had about 6,000 soldiers left. His supply lines were stretched thin. His Native American scouts were mostly gone, but he pressed on, perhaps hoping that if he could break through to Albany, reinforcements could reach him from New York. On September 19, Bergen attacked the American position at Freeman's Farm. The fighting was intense. British discipline and tactics were pitted against American marksmanship and defensive positions. Benedict Arnold, leading American forces, fought aggressively. The British technically won by holding the field at the end of the day, but they suffered heavy casualties and didn't break through the American lines. Bergen waited, hoping for reinforcements or support from New York. None came. The American army grew larger as more militia arrived. Bergen's supplies dwindled. On October 7, increasingly desperate, Bergen attacked again at Bemis Heights. This time, the Americans decisively defeated the British assault. Arnold again played a major role, aggressively leading attacks until he was wounded. The British were driven back with heavy losses. Bergen retreated to Saratoga, surrounded by American forces that now outnumbered him more than 2-1. His supplies were nearly exhausted. His soldiers were demoralized. Escape was impossible. On October 17, 1777, Burgoyne surrendered his entire army. Nearly 6,000 British and German soldiers laid down their arms. It was the greatest American victory of the war so far, and it changed everything. The French connection and Valley forged the American victory at Saratoga had immediate and far-reaching consequences. In America, it proved that the Continental Army could defeat British regulars in a major battle. It boosted morale when morale desperately needed boosting. It made the cause of independence seem achievable rather than just a hopeless dream. But the most important consequence was in Europe, particularly in France. France had been watching the American Revolution with great interest. They were still bitter about losing the 7 Years' War to Britain, and the idea of supporting British rebels was appealing. But France was also cautious. Supporting a rebellion that would probably fail was pointless. France needed to see that the Americans had a real chance of winning before committing to an alliance. Saratoga provided that proof. Benjamin Franklin had been in France since late 1776, serving as an unofficial American ambassador. He was perfect for the role. At age 70, he was internationally famous for his scientific work and writings. He was charming, witty, cultured. He spoke French reasonably well. He played up his image as a simple American, wearing plain clothes and a fur cap, while French aristocrats wore elaborate wigs and formal dress. The French loved him. Franklin had been carefully negotiating with the French government, pushing for an alliance, while the French remained non-committal. News of Saratoga changed the calculation. If the Americans could actually win this war, then a French alliance could humiliate Britain and recover some of what France had lost. In February 1778, France and America signed 2 treaties. The Treaty of Amity and Commerce established trade relations. The Treaty of Alliance was a military alliance where France formally recognized American independence, and both countries agreed not to make peace with Britain without the other's consent. France was now officially at war with Britain. This was huge. France had the second most powerful military in Europe, a substantial navy, and lots of money to lend. French support would provide supplies, funds, military expertise, and most importantly, naval power that could challenge British control of the seas. The war wasn't just a colonial rebellion anymore. It was now part of a larger European conflict. The British government was worried. Fighting the Americans was one thing. Fighting France was much more serious. And there were concerns that Spain and the Netherlands might join France, which they eventually did. Britain started looking for a way to end the American war quickly so they could focus on the European threat. In early 1778, the British government offered the Americans basically everything they'd originally wanted back in 1775. No more taxes from Parliament. Representation in Parliament if they wanted it. The intolerable acts repealed. American officials could remain in office. Everything except independence. Stay in the empire, the British said, and we'll address all your grievances. The Americans said no. They'd declared independence. They had a French alliance. They weren't going back. So the war continued, but now with French involvement. The British evacuated Philadelphia in June 1778, consolidating their forces in New York because they needed to defend the Caribbean and other valuable possessions from France. The Americans reoccupied Philadelphia without a fight. But let's back up a moment to talk about what Washington's army had been doing while all this diplomacy was happening, because it was having a miserable time. After failing to defend Philadelphia, Washington took his army into winter quarters at Valley Forge, Pennsylvania, in December 1777. It's about 20 miles northwest of Philadelphia, defensible enough, close enough to watch the British in Philadelphia, far enough to be relatively safe from surprise attack. Valley Forge has become legendary as a symbol of American suffering and perseverance during the Revolution. And it was genuinely awful, though not quite as dramatically horrible as the myths sometimes suggest. When the army arrived at Valley Forge, the soldiers built log huts for shelter, sleeping in tents until the huts were finished. The huts were cramped, 12 soldiers per hut, that was 16 by 14 feet, but they were better than tents. The bigger problem was supplies. Congress and the state governments were supposed to provide food, clothing, and equipment, but the system kept breaking down. Soldiers went hungry regularly. There were days when the army had no meat. Some soldiers had no shoes and wrapped their feet in rags. Clothing was insufficient, blankets inadequate. The Continental Army's supply system was a disaster of corruption, incompetence, and insufficient resources. Contractors stole supplies. State governments failed to send what was promised. Transportation was inadequate, and there was never enough money to buy what they needed. Disease was the worst problem. In the unsanitary conditions of the camp, with inadequate nutrition and shelter, typhoid, typhus, dysentery, and pneumonia spread rapidly. About 2,000 soldiers died at Valley Forge during the winter of 1777-78, mostly from disease. That's about 20% of the army. Washington spent the winter dealing with one crisis after another. Supply problems, desertions, a conspiracy by some officers and members of Congress who thought he should be replaced as commander, which became known as the Conway Cabal. Disputes over promotions and command, political interference from Congress. It was exhausting and miserable. But something important also happened at Valley Forge. Baron Friedrich Wilhelm von Steuben, a Prussian officer who had joined the American cause, arrived in February 1778 and started training the army. Steuben was probably not actually a baron, and he'd exaggerated his military resume, but he knew how to drill soldiers, and he was exactly what the Continental Army needed. Steuben wrote a training manual adapted for American circumstances. He simplified Prussian drill procedures. He trained a model company, which then trained other companies. He taught the soldiers how to move in formation, how to load and fire more efficiently, how to use the bayonet properly. He turned the Continental Army from a mob that sort of knew how to fight into a professional force. When the army marched out of Valley Forge in June 1778, following the British evacuation of Philadelphia, it was much more capable than than when it had arrived. The soldiers had survived the winter. They'd been trained. They'd received news of the French alliance, which boosted morale dramatically. They were ready to fight. On June 28, the Continental Army caught up with the British at Monmouth, New Jersey, as the British were marching back to New York. General Charles Lee, who had been captured by the British and recently exchanged, was in command of the American advance force. Lee ordered a retreat when he encountered the main British force, which created confusion and threatened to turn into a rout. Washington arrived, found his army retreating in disorder, and reportedly unleashed a torrent of profanity at Lee. Washington almost never lost his temper publicly, but he was furious. He rallied the troops, reformed the lines, and stood against the British counterattack. The two armies fought to a draw in 100-degree heat that killed more men than the combat did. The British slipped away during the night and continued to New York. Monmouth wasn't a decisive victory, but it showed that the Continental Army could stand and fight against British regulars in open combat. The training at Valley Forge had worked. The army was becoming a real professional force, and now they had French support. The war was entering a new phase. The French alliance didn't immediately transform the war. It took time for French forces to arrive, coordinate with the Americans, and plan joint operations. Meanwhile, the British changed their strategy. Since France was now involved, Britain had to worry about defending its valuable Caribbean islands, protecting its other colonies, and potentially facing invasion at home. The British government decided to shift the focus of the American war to the south. The southern colonies had larger loyalist populations, or so the British believed. If they could pacify the south, they could then move north, rally the loyalists, and gradually suppress the rebellion. In late 1778, the British captured Savannah, Georgia. In 1780, they besieged and captured Charleston, South Carolina, along with about 5,000 Continental soldiers, in one of the worst American defeats of the war. The British established control over much of Georgia and South Carolina. The Southern strategy seemed to be working, except the British were misunderstanding the situation. Yes, there were loyalists in the South, but there were also lots of patriots, and soon the region devolved into a vicious civil war. Patriot militias fought loyalist militias. Both sides committed atrocities. Neighbors who'd known each other for years suddenly became enemies. It was brutal and bitter in ways that the fighting in the North had never been. The British, trying to control the countryside with limited forces, relied on loyalist militias to keep order. This didn't work. The Patriot militias kept fighting back. British outposts were harassed or destroyed. Supply lines were attacked. The British controlled the cities and major towns, but couldn't pacify the rural areas. In the North, the war had reached a kind of stalemate. The British held New York City and some other coastal positions. Washington's army, encamped in the Hudson Highlands, wasn't strong enough to attack the British positions, but was sufficient to prevent British expansion. Both sides conducted raids and minor operations, but there were no major battles. The real fighting had shifted to the south, and it was going to stay there for the rest of the war. Treason, stubbornness, and southern misery. Let's drift over to Benedict Arnold, who has the distinction of being America's most famous traitor. Arnold's story is fascinating because he was genuinely one of the best generals the Continental Army had. He was brave, aggressive, brilliant tactically. He'd been instrumental in the victory at Saratoga. He'd fought courageously at Quebec, Valcour Island, and numerous other engagements. Washington respected him. Congress had promoted him. He was a genuine war hero. He was also deeply insecure, perpetually broke, felt underappreciated, and had a talent for making enemies. He fought with other officers over credit for victories. He felt Congress didn't recognize his contributions. He was court-martialed on minor charges brought by Pennsylvania officials, and while largely acquitted, received a reprimand from Washington that he felt was undeserved. His pride was wounded. His finances were a disaster, and he believed he'd been treated unjustly. In 1779, Arnold married Margaret Peggy Shippen, daughter of a prominent Philadelphia Loyalist family. Peggy and Arnold lived beyond their means in Philadelphia, entertaining lavishly, while Arnold was supposed to be serving as military commander of the city. His debts mounted. His resentment grew, and he started thinking about switching sides. In 1780, Arnold was given command of West Point, the crucial American fortress controlling the Hudson River, and he began secretly negotiating with the British to surrender it. He worked through Major John Andre, a British officer, exchanging letters hidden in Peggy's writing or using invisible ink. Arnold provided intelligence to the British and planned to turn West Point over for £20,000 and a commission in the British Army. The plot fell apart in September 1780 when Andre was captured carrying incriminating documents. Arnold escaped to British-controlled New York, received a smaller payment than promised, and was commissioned as a brigadier general in the British Army. Peggy joined him, playing the part of an innocent wife who knew nothing about her husband's treason, though she'd actually been involved in the plot from the beginning. Andre was tried as a spy and hanged, which some people thought was unnecessarily harsh since he'd been operating under orders and in uniform when captured. But the rules of war were clear, and the Americans wanted to make an example. Arnold lived the rest of his life in Britain, never fully trusted by the British who'd questioned why, if he'd betrayed his country once, they should believe he wouldn't betray them. He died in 1801, largely forgotten and despised in America. Arnold's treason shocked Americans. If one of their best generals could betray the cause, who else might? But it also seemed to harden American resolve. They'd come too far and sacrificed too much to give up now. The cause was bigger than one man, even a hero turned traitor. Meanwhile, in the South, the war was going badly for the Americans through most of 1780. After Charleston fell, the British controlled most of Georgia and South Carolina. General Horatio Gates, the hero of Saratoga, was sent south to rebuild American forces. In August 1780, He led his army against a British force at Camden, South Carolina. The battle was a complete disaster. Gates made tactical errors. His militia fled at the start of the battle. His Continental troops fought well, but were overwhelmed. About 1,000 Americans were killed or captured. Gates himself fled so fast that he rode 180 miles in 3 days, which was impressive horsemanship, but terrible leadership. His military reputation never recovered. But even as the British seemed to be winning in the South, problems were emerging. In October 1780, a Loyalist force was destroyed by Patriot militia at Kings Mountain on the border of North and South Carolina. About 1,000 Loyalists were killed, wounded, or captured. It was a turning point that showed the British couldn't rely on Loyalist militias to control the backcountry. Washington sent Nathanael Greene to take command of American forces in the South after Gates' failure. Greene was one of Washington's best generals, methodical, strategic, good at logistics. He found his Southern army in terrible condition. About 2,000 soldiers, many poorly equipped, insufficient supplies, low morale. Greene split his forces, sending Daniel Morgan with about 600 men to conduct operations in western South Carolina, while he reorganized the main army. In January 1781, Morgan's force was cornered by a British force under Colonel Banastre Tarleton at Cowpens, South Carolina. Tarleton was aggressive and confident. He attacked immediately, expecting an easy victory. Instead, Morgan had set up his troops brilliantly. He used his militia as a skirmish line, then fell back in apparent retreat, drawing the British into a position where they were hit by Continental regulars and cavalry. The British force was destroyed. About 110 British soldiers killed, over 200 wounded, 500 captured. American losses were minimal. Cornwallis, commanding British forces in the South, was furious. He decided to chase Morgan and Greene's forces, hoping to destroy them. What followed was a race across North Carolina as Greene led Cornwallis on a chase that exhausted the British army. Greene kept just ahead of Cornwallis, crossing rivers and burning bridges behind him. Cornwallis pushed his army hard, abandoning his baggage train to move faster. It was February, cold and rainy, and both armies were miserable. Greene finally turned to fight at Guilford Courthouse in March 1781. The British won technically because they held the field after a long and bloody battle. But they suffered so many casualties that it was effectively a defeat. Cornwallis had lost about a quarter of his army. He couldn't keep fighting in the Carolina backcountry. He retreated to the coast, then marched into Virginia, hoping to find more success there. Greene didn't chase Cornwallis. Instead, he moved back into South Carolina and started systematically reducing British outposts. Through the spring and summer of 1781, Greene fought a campaign of small battles and sieges, gradually pushing the British back until they controlled little beyond Charleston and Savannah. Greene lost most of the battles tactically, but won the campaign strategically. It was brilliant generalship, the kind that doesn't make dramatic stories, but wins wars. Meanwhile, Cornwallis marched through Virginia, raiding and skirmishing with American forces. He captured supplies, fought small actions, and generally created chaos. But he wasn't achieving anything strategic. He was just moving around, winning minor victories that didn't affect the larger war. In August 1781, Cornwallis received orders to establish a naval base that could be protected and supplied by the British fleet. He chose Yorktown, Virginia, on the York River near the Chesapeake Bay. It seemed like a reasonable choice. The Navy could supply him there. He could defend the position. He'd be safe while the British figured out what to do next. Cornwallis did not know that he'd just walked into a trap. Yorktown and the long goodbye Washington had spent 1781 frustrated. His army was camped outside New York, watching the British, but unable to attack. The French had sent troops under General Rochambeau, but they hadn't coordinated on any major operations. Washington wanted to attack New York, but Rochambeau was skeptical they could succeed. Both armies just sat there, occasionally conducting raids, but mostly waiting for something to change. What changed was French naval power. In August 1781, Washington learned that the French West Indies fleet under Admiral de Grasse was sailing north to the Chesapeake and would be available for operations for a limited time. Suddenly, there was an opportunity. If the French Navy could control the Chesapeake Bay and cut off Cornwallis at Yorktown from seaborne supply and evacuation, and if Washington and Rochambeau could move their armies south fast enough, they could trap Cornwallis and force a decisive battle. It was a long shot that required precise timing and coordination, but it was the best opportunity they'd had in years. Washington and Rochambeau marched south with their combined forces, about 7,000 Americans and 5,000 French. They moved fast, keeping the British in New York confused about their objective. The British thought they might be attacking New York until it became clear the Allies were heading south. By then, it was too late to help Cornwallis. The French fleet arrived at the Chesapeake in late August and positioned itself to block British naval access. On September 5, a British fleet arrived to try to relieve Cornwallis. The two fleets fought an inconclusive battle, but the British fleet was damaged and withdrew to New York for repairs. The French maintained control of the Chesapeake. Cornwallis was cut off. Washington and Rochambeau's forces arrived at Yorktown in late September and began siege operations. Cornwallis had about 8,000 soldiers in Yorktown and Gloucester, Point across the river. Allies had about 17,000 troops and began digging siege lines, bringing up artillery, and systematically tightening the noose around the British positions. The siege followed the classic pattern of 18th century warfare. Dig trenches closer to the enemy fortifications, build artillery positions, bombard the defenses, dig closer, bombard more. Eventually, assault the weakened fortifications and force a surrender. It was methodical, professional, and almost inevitable once the siege began. Cornwallis hoped the British fleet would return and evacuate his army or bring reinforcements. He sent messages to New York begging for help. But the British fleet was still being repaired and couldn't sail immediately. Cornwallis was on his own. On October 14, American and French forces assaulted two key British redoubts. Alexander Hamilton, serving as a lieutenant colonel, led the American assault on one redoubt with dramatic bravery. The French took the other. Both assaults succeeded. The Allies moved their artillery even closer. The bombardment of Yorktown intensified. Cornwallis tried a desperate breakout attempt on the night of October 16, trying to ferry his troops across the river to Gloucester Point, and then break through the forces besieging that position. A storm scattered the boats, and the attempt failed. Cornwallis had no options left. On October 17, 1781, Cornwallis began surrender negotiations. On October 19, the British Army marched out of Yorktown and surrendered. According to tradition, the British band played "The World Turned Upside Down," though there's debate about whether this actually happened. Cornwallis claimed illness and didn't attend the surrender ceremony, sending a subordinate to hand over his sword. About 8,000 British soldiers surrendered at Yorktown, along with hundreds of loyalists and camp followers. It was the largest British surrender of the war, and as it turned out, the last major battle. The war wasn't officially over, but Yorktown convinced the British that they couldn't win. When news of Yorktown reached London in November, the government was stunned. Lord North, the Prime Minister, reportedly said, "Oh God, it is all over." He was essentially right. Parliament turned against continuing the war. The opposition gained strength. In March 1782, Parliament voted to end offensive operations in America. North resigned, and a new government began peace negotiations. But the war didn't end immediately. It kept dragging on for another year and a half while diplomats negotiated the peace treaty. British troops still occupied New York, Charleston, and Savannah. The Continental Army stayed in the field, watching them. There were occasional small skirmishes. Loyalists wondered what would happen to them when the British finally left. Everyone was tired, broke, and ready for it to be over. The peace negotiations were complex because multiple countries were involved. America, Britain, France, and Spain all had different interests. The American negotiators were Benjamin Franklin, John Adams, and John Jay. They were supposed to coordinate with France, but they ended up negotiating separately with Britain because they didn't entirely trust the French not to sacrifice American interests for their own. The Americans wanted independence, obviously, and they wanted generous boundaries that would give them control of territory west to the Mississippi River. The British were willing to grant independence, but argued about the boundaries and about compensation for loyalists whose property had been confiscated. The Americans refused to guarantee loyalist compensation, but agreed to recommend that states restore loyalist property, which was meaningless, but gave the British something to show they'd tried. The preliminary peace treaty was signed in November 1782. The final Treaty of Paris wasn't signed until September 3, 1783. The treaty recognized American independence, established boundaries from the Atlantic Ocean to the Mississippi River, and from Canada to Florida, granted Americans fishing rights off Newfoundland, and included vague provisions about Loyalist property that would be largely ignored. British troops evacuated Savannah in July 1782 and Charleston in December. New York, the last British-held city, was evacuated in November 1783. On November 25, Washington and the Continental Army marched into New York City. It was finally truly over. On December 4, 1783, Washington said farewell to his officers at Fraunces Tavern in New York. According to witnesses, he was emotional, embracing his officers with tears in his eyes. He'd led the Continental Army for 8.5 years through defeats, hardships, near disasters, and occasional triumphs. Now it was done. Washington then traveled to Annapolis, Maryland, where Congress was meeting. On December 23, 1783, he formally resigned his commission as Commander-in-Chief. This was significant. Washington had been given enormous power. He'd commanded the army through the entire war. He was beloved by his soldiers and respected by Congress. If he'd wanted to seize power, become a military dictator, he probably could have. Instead, he gave up his authority and went home. This act of voluntary relinquishment of power would become one of the defining moments in American history. King George III, when he heard about it, reportedly said that if Washington did that, he would be the greatest man in the world. And in terms of establishing a precedent for civilian control of the military and the peaceful transfer of power, it really was remarkable. Washington went home to Mount Vernon, probably thinking he was done with public service. He wasn't, but that's another story for another time. What it all meant and didn't. So let's drift toward the end here and think about what the American Revolution actually accomplished, because it's more complicated than just America won independence. Obviously, they did win independence. 13 British colonies became a new nation, the United States of America. That was historically significant. Colonies didn't usually successfully rebel against their mother countries, especially not against one of the most powerful empires in the world. The Revolution also established, at least in theory, some important principles. The idea that governments derive their legitimacy from the consent of the governed. That people have natural rights that governments should protect. That when governments fail to protect those rights, the people can change or abolish them. These weren't new ideas, but the revolution put them into practice in a way that would influence future revolutions and democratic movements worldwide. The revolution forced Americans to think seriously about how to structure a government based on these principles. They wrote state constitutions. They tried to create a national government with the Articles of Confederation. When that didn't work, they'd eventually write the Constitution, though that happened after the period we're discussing. Revolution started a long, messy, ongoing experiment in Republican government. But the revolution also left enormous unresolved problems and contradictions. The most obvious was slavery. The Declaration of Independence proclaimed that all men are created equal, while many of the men who signed it owned slaves. Some of the northern states began gradual emancipation processes during or shortly after the Revolution. But slavery was deeply entrenched in the Southern economy and society. The founders largely avoided confronting this contradiction directly, which would have catastrophic consequences in the 19th century. The Revolution also didn't address women's rights in any meaningful way. Women had played important roles during the war, managing farms and businesses, supporting the army, and sometimes even fighting. But the new nation didn't extend political rights to women. That wouldn't begin to change until the 19th and 20th centuries. Native Americans were largely excluded from the new nation's political community and would face increasing pressure as American settlement expanded westward. The Revolution's outcome was terrible for many Native American peoples who'd hoped that limiting colonial expansion was in their interest. The new United States, freed from British restrictions on Western settlement, would push aggressively into Native American territories. Loyalists suffered enormously. Thousands left America during and after the war, going to Britain, Canada, or other British territories. Those who stayed often faced discrimination, property confiscation, and social ostracism. The Revolution was as much a civil war as a war of independence, and civil wars leave bitter divisions. The war itself had been devastating. Nobody knows exactly how many people died, but estimates suggest something like 25,000 to 70,000 American deaths, depending on whether you count disease, civilian casualties, and other war-related deaths. The British lost about 24,000 soldiers. There were also German, French, Spanish, Dutch, and Native American casualties. For a total American population of only 2.5 million, the proportional impact was enormous. The economy was disrupted. Trade patterns were broken. Debt was massive at all levels of government. Inflation had destroyed the value of paper money. Rebuilding would take years. The 1780s would be difficult economically for the new nation. And politically, the new nation was unstable. The Articles of Confederation government was weak and ineffective. States were acting like semi-independent countries, imposing tariffs on each other's goods, refusing to pay their share of national debts, ignoring Congress. There were armed uprisings, like Shays' Rebellion in Massachusetts in 1786, by farmers and veterans protesting debt and economic conditions. It wasn't clear that this new United States would survive as a unified nation, but they'd achieved independence. They'd created a nation based, however imperfectly, on principles of self-government and individual rights. They'd proven that colonial rebellion against a European empire was possible, and they'd set in motion political and social changes that would continue developing over the following centuries. The Revolution didn't create a perfect society. It didn't solve all problems, but it was a beginning, a messy, complicated, contradictory beginning to an experiment in self-government that's still ongoing. The human cost and forgotten stories before we wrap up. Let's think about some of the people whose experiences don't make it into the usual telling of the revolution, because the war wasn't just fought by famous generals and founding fathers. It affected millions of ordinary people whose stories are mostly forgotten. Consider the soldiers in the Continental Army. Most were young men from poor or middling backgrounds. They enlisted for various reasons. Some believed in independence. Some needed the money, though they often didn't get paid. Some were drafted. Some took the place of wealthier men who'd paid them to serve in their stead. Life in the Continental Army was hard. Pay was irregular. Supplies were inadequate. Medical care was primitive. Soldiers suffered from disease, cold, hunger, and boredom, punctuated by moments of terror in combat. Many deserted. Some served faithfully for years, through terrible conditions, for a cause they might not have fully understood or believed in, but which had become their reality. After the war, many veterans received little recognition or compensation. Congress had promised pensions and land grants, but the national government was too weak and broke to deliver on most of these promises for years. Veterans often found themselves impoverished, struggling to reintegrate into civilian life, dealing with war injuries without adequate support. Some ended up destitute. The romanticized image of Revolutionary War veterans as honored heroes doesn't match the reality that many faced. Women experienced the revolution in complex ways. With men away fighting, women had to manage farms, businesses, and households alone. They had more responsibility and autonomy during the war years. Some followed the armies as camp followers, cooking, washing, nursing, and sometimes fighting. Mary Ludwig Hayes, known as Molly Pitcher, supposedly took her husband's place at a cannon during the Battle of Monmouth. Deborah Sampson disguised herself as a man and served in the Continental Army. Margaret Corbin served alongside her husband and continued fighting after he was killed. But after the war, social expectations pushed women back into traditional roles. The increased autonomy many had experienced during the war didn't translate into expanded legal or political rights. Women couldn't vote, couldn't own property in their own names if married, had limited legal rights. The revolution's ideals of liberty and equality didn't extend to them. Enslaved people faced particular complexities. Both sides tried to use slavery as a weapon. The British offered freedom to slaves who escaped from patriot owners and joined the British forces. Lord Dunmore's proclamation in Virginia and later British policies attracted thousands of enslaved people who saw the British as potential liberators. After the war, many were evacuated with the British forces, some to freedom in Canada or Britain, others betrayed and sold back into slavery in the Caribbean. On the Patriot side, some enslaved people were promised freedom if they served in the Continental Army. Some northern states began gradual emancipation during the Revolution, motivated partly by the Revolution's ideals, and partly by the fact that slavery was less economically important in the North. But in the South, slavery became more entrenched. Planters who'd lost property and income during the war were even more determined to maintain the slave system that supported their economy. African Americans fought on both sides for different reasons and with different results. After the war, free Black communities grew in the North, but discrimination remained severe. In the South, the Revolution ultimately strengthened rather than weakened slavery. Native Americans were caught in an impossible situation. Different tribes had different strategies. Some tried to remain neutral. Some allied with the British, seeing them as a lesser threat to their lands than American settlers. Some allied with the Americans, hoping for better treatment. Most were disappointed. The Revolution removed British restrictions on westward expansion and led to increased American settlement in Native American territories. The new United States government would continue policies of removal and displacement. Revolution was devastating for many Native peoples, setting the stage for further losses in the 19th century. The war also affected ordinary people who just wanted to be left alone. Civilians in war zones faced violence from both sides. Armies requisitioned supplies, often without payment. Homes were damaged or destroyed. Trade was disrupted. Food was scarce. Disease spread. People displaced by fighting became refugees. The Revolution divided communities and families. Neighbors became enemies. Families split between patriot and loyalist sympathies. In some areas, particularly in the South, the conflict devolved into civil war, with atrocities committed by both sides against civilians. The violence and divisions took generations to heal, and there were all the people affected by the war who were never counted or remembered. Camp followers who died of disease, civilians killed in crossfire, children who lost parents, communities destroyed, people whose names never made it into any records, but whose lives were shaped by events they had little control over. The American Revolution is usually told as a story of great men and momentous decisions, battles and treaties, principles and politics. And those things matter. But it was also the story of millions of ordinary people trying to survive extraordinary circumstances, making difficult choices with imperfect information, dealing with consequences they never anticipated. Legacy and final thoughts. So here we are at the end, or at least near it, because the story of the American Revolution never really ends. It keeps echoing through American history and beyond. The Revolution established the United States as an independent nation, which would grow into one of the most powerful and influential countries in the world. That's obviously significant. The United States would eventually extend from the Atlantic to the Pacific, become an industrial and military power, and shape global politics in ways the founders couldn't have imagined. The Revolution's ideals, the language of liberty and equality and self-government, would inspire other revolutions and independence movements. The French Revolution drew on American example and rhetoric. Latin American independence movements in the 19th century looked to the American Revolution as a precedent. Anti-colonial movements in the 20th century invoked the American Revolution's principles. The idea that people had the right to determine their own government became powerful globally. even if the implementation was always complicated. Within the United States, the revolution's principles would be invoked by successive generations, fighting for expanded rights and equality. Abolitionists argued that slavery contradicted the revolution's ideals. Women's suffrage advocates pointed to all men are created equal and asked why that didn't include women. Civil rights activists in the 20th century called America to live up to its founding principles. The revolution's language created standards that America itself often failed to meet, but those standards could be used to push for progress. The revolution also established important precedents for how the United States would function as a nation. Washington's resignation set the precedent for civilian control of the military and peaceful transfer of power. The experience of the revolution convinced Americans that they needed a stronger national government, leading to the Constitutional Convention in 1787. The idea that government should be based on written constitutions became central to American political culture. But the revolution also established or reinforced some troubling patterns. The expansion across North America would come at enormous cost to Native Americans. The compromise over slavery, avoiding that confrontation in order to achieve independence, stored up problems that would explode in the Civil War. The tension between ideals of equality and the reality of social hierarchies and exclusions would persist. And there's the question of whether the revolution was really that revolutionary. Yes, America became independent. Yes, it established Republican government. But social hierarchies largely persisted. The wealthy elite remained in power, just with different titles. Slavery continued and expanded. Women's rights didn't change. Many ordinary people found that independence didn't dramatically improve their daily lives. Some historians argue that the American Revolution was relatively conservative compared to other revolutions. It didn't fundamentally restructure society. It didn't involve mass violence against elites. The same sorts of people who'd been influential before the revolution remained influential after. The revolution changed political authority, but preserved many existing social and economic structures. Others argue that the revolution was genuinely transformative, that establishing the principle of popular sovereignty and creating a republic in a world of monarchies was radical, that the revolution set in motion changes that would unfold over generations. Both perspectives have merit. The American Revolution was a war, a political transformation, a social disruption, a founding myth, and an ongoing argument about what America should be. It was brutal and idealistic, practical and philosophical, heroic and hypocritical. It created a nation that would become tremendously powerful and influential, and that nation would spend the next 2.5 centuries trying to figure out what its founding principles actually meant and how to apply them. The men who fought at Lexington and conquered in 1775 probably didn't imagine they were starting an 8-year war that would create a new nation. The delegates who signed the Declaration of Independence in 1776 probably didn't fully grasp the long-term implications of what they were doing. Washington and his soldiers at Valley Forge probably just wanted to survive the winter. But collectively, through thousands of decisions and actions and sacrifices and compromises, they created something new. Whether what they created was good or bad depends on your perspective and which aspects you emphasize. The revolution brought independence and established principles of self-government. It also continued slavery, dispossessed native peoples, and excluded most people from political participation. It was both a beginning and a missed opportunity, both an achievement and a tragedy. And maybe that's the most honest way to think about it, not as a simple story of heroism and triumph, but as a complex, contradictory historical moment when people tried to create something better and partially succeeded and partially failed, and left future generations to continue the work, still arguing about what the revolution meant and what America should be. So that's the American Revolution. 8 years of war, thousands of deaths, enormous disruption and sacrifice, and at the end, a new nation that would spend the next 2 centuries figuring out what it actually wanted to be. It wasn't the clean, inspiring story that sometimes gets told. It was messy, brutal, complicated, full of contradictions and compromises. People made heroic sacrifices and committed terrible acts. Grand principles coexisted with base motives. Idealism mixed with pragmatism, nobility with pettiness. But somehow, out of all that mess, came a nation. Imperfect, flawed, but genuinely new. A republic in a world of monarchies. A nation founded on principles of self-government, even if it didn't extend those principles to everyone. A beginning, not an ending. And maybe that's enough for one very long night. Thanks for staying with this journey through the revolution. Hopefully somewhere along the way, you drifted off peacefully, because that's really the point of these long historical rambles. But if you made it all the way here, well, now you know more about the American Revolution than you probably wanted to. Sleep well. The revolution is over. The work of building a nation was just beginning. But that's a story for another time. The aftermath when the war ended, but problems didn't all right. We're still here, still drifting through history. Let's keep going with what happened after Yorktown, because the period between 1781 and 1783 was this weird limbo where everyone knew the war was basically over, but it wasn't officially over, and nobody was quite sure what came next. Washington's army stayed in the field, camped in the Hudson Highlands, watching the British in New York. The soldiers were exhausted, broke, and wanted to go home, but they couldn't leave until the British left, and the British were taking their time evacuating. Meanwhile, Congress had no money to pay the soldiers what they were owed. The army had been promised back pay, pensions for officers, land grants. Congress had promised all of this with no idea how they'd actually deliver on any of it. By early 1783, the army was getting restless. Officers were particularly upset because they'd served for years. Many had sacrificed their personal fortunes, and now it looked like Congress would just send them home with worthless certificates of debt. In March 1783, anonymous letters circulated among the officers at the Newburgh camp, suggesting they should refuse to disband until Congress paid them. Some letters hinted at more direct action, maybe even a military coup. This was dangerous. An army that doesn't get paid and refuses to disband is a threat to any government, especially a weak one like Congress. Washington called a meeting of his officers on March 15. He gave a speech appealing to their patriotism, reminding them what they'd fought for, asking them not to betray the cause now by threatening civilian authority. Then he tried to read a letter from a congressman and had trouble seeing it. He pulled out reading glasses, which most of his officers had never seen him wear. "Gentlemen," he said, "you will permit me to put on my spectacles, for I have not only grown gray, but almost blind in the service of my country." It was a small human moment. Washington, their commander, admitting age and frailty, reminding them of his own sacrifices. According to witnesses, some officers were in tears. The conspiracy, if that's what it was, collapsed. The officers pledged their continued loyalty to Congress and civilian authority. It was another crucial moment in establishing the precedent that the military would remain subordinate to civilian government, even when the military had legitimate grievances. Congress eventually gave the officers 5 years full pay in bonds and promised 3 months' pay for enlisted men, though actually delivering on these promises would take years, and some veterans never received what they were owed. But the immediate crisis passed. The Treaty of Paris was finally signed in September 1783. The British began evacuating New York in November. Loyalists packed up and left, about 3,000 of them sailing to Nova Scotia and other British territories. Some freed slaves left with the British despite American protests that they were property that should be returned. Some enslaved people tried to leave, but were recaptured. It was chaotic and bitter. On November 25, 1783, the last British troops boarded ships and left New York. Washington and the Continental Army marched into the city. It should have been triumphant, and in some ways it was, but it was also melancholy. The war was over. People were exhausted. The city had been occupied for 7 years and was in rough shape. And now everyone had to figure out how to actually run an independent nation. Washington said goodbye to his officers at Fraunce's Tavern in December, resigned his commission, and went home to Mount Vernon. The Continental Army was disbanded. Soldiers went home to try to rebuild their lives. Congress moved from Annapolis to Trenton to New York, never quite settled because they didn't have a permanent capital and couldn't agree on where it should be. And the United States entered what historians call the critical period, the years from 1783 to 1789, when it wasn't clear that the nation would survive. The Articles of Confederation government was struggling. Congress had almost no power. It couldn't tax. It couldn't regulate interstate commerce. It couldn't enforce its own laws. States were supposed to voluntarily contribute funds, but they often didn't. Congress couldn't pay its debts, couldn't pay veterans, couldn't maintain a military force, couldn't conduct effective diplomacy because foreign governments didn't take it seriously. Each state was acting like an independent country. They imposed tariffs on each other's goods. They printed their own money. They made their own foreign policy. New York and New Jersey had a trade war. Virginia and Maryland argued over navigation rights on the Potomac River. It was messy and inefficient. The national debt was enormous. Congress owed money to foreign governments, primarily France and the Netherlands. It owed money to American citizens who'd loaned money to finance the war. It owed back pay to veterans. The total debt was something like $75 million, which in 1780s money was staggering. And Congress had no way to pay it. States had their own debts from the war. They tried various methods to manage them. Some raised taxes, which was unpopular with people who were already economically struggling. Some printed more paper money, which caused inflation. Some tried to pay debts with land grants in Western territories. Nothing worked very well. The economy was depressed. The war had disrupted trade. American merchants couldn't trade with the British West Indies anymore, which had been a major market. Britain was dumping cheap manufactured goods in America, underselling American craftsmen. There were shortages of hard currency. Credit was tight. Farmers were struggling with debt. In Massachusetts, the situation got bad enough that it led to an armed rebellion. In 1786, farmers in western Massachusetts, many of them Revolutionary War veterans, were facing foreclosures because they couldn't pay their debts and taxes. The state government, dominated by Eastern merchants and creditors, wasn't sympathetic. Courts were ordering property seized and people imprisoned for debt. Daniel Shays, a former Continental Army captain, led a group of armed farmers in preventing courts from sitting, so foreclosures couldn't proceed. Hundreds of men took up arms. They closed courthouses. They marched on the federal arsenal at Springfield to seize weapons. The state militia eventually suppressed the rebellion, but it shocked the political establishment. Shays' rebellion terrified many of the revolutionary leaders. It looked like the social order was breaking down. It suggested that maybe too much democracy was dangerous, that ordinary people couldn't be trusted with too much power. It convinced many that the Articles of Confederation government was too weak to maintain order, and that something needed to change. George Washington, watching from Mount Vernon, was worried. He'd spent 8 years fighting to create an independent nation, and now it looked like that nation might tear itself apart from internal conflicts. He started thinking that maybe he needed to get involved in politics after all, much as he wanted to just retire and manage his plantation. Other leaders were reaching the same conclusion. The Articles of Confederation weren't working. The national government needed more power. There needed to be some way to regulate commerce between states, to collect revenue, to pay debts, to conduct effective foreign policy, to maintain order. But changing the Articles required unanimous consent of all 13 states, which was impossible to achieve. So instead, some leaders started talking about calling a convention to revise the Articles. Maybe if they got delegates together, they could work out amendments that would strengthen the national government without completely abandoning the existing system. In 1787, delegates from 12 states met in Philadelphia for what was supposed to be a convention to revise the Articles of Confederation. Rhode Island didn't send anyone because Rhode Island was weird and didn't trust any plan to strengthen national government. The other states sent their most prominent leaders. Washington presided. Franklin attended, though he was 81 and in declining health. Madison, Hamilton, and other key figures were there. And almost immediately, they decided to scrap the Articles entirely and write a new constitution, which was probably beyond their legal authority. But they did it anyway because they thought the nation's survival required it. But that's getting ahead of where we are in the story. We're still in the mid-1780s, and the United States is struggling to function as a nation. The Confederation's struggles and daily realities. Let's think about what life was actually like for ordinary Americans in the 1780s, because most people weren't thinking about constitutional reform. They were just trying to get by. For farmers, which was most of the population, the post-war years were economically difficult. During the war, the army had needed supplies, so farmers could sell their produce even if they weren't always paid promptly or in reliable currency. After the war, that market disappeared. Prices dropped. Farmers who'd taken on debt during the war to expand production or make up for labor shortages suddenly found themselves unable to repay. The shortage of hard currency made everything harder. There was some gold and silver coin in circulation, but not enough. Much of what people had was paper money, either continental dollars that were nearly worthless or state-issued paper that varied in value. This made trade complicated. How much was a bushel of wheat worth? Depended on what you were being paid in. Merchants had different problems. They'd built up businesses serving wartime needs. Now they had to reorient to peacetime markets. British merchants were flooding American markets with cheap goods, underselling American craftsmen. American merchants couldn't access British markets the way they had before the war. New trade relationships with other European countries were developing slowly. Urban workers and craftsmen faced competition from cheap British imports and from a flood of wartime soldiers returning and looking for work. Wages were low. Work was uncertain. Many skilled craftsmen had trouble supporting their families. Veterans had the added burden of dealing with war injuries and trauma with minimal support. A soldier who'd lost a leg or arm or had been disabled by disease during the war had few options for support. Some states provided small pensions. Some communities took care of their veterans informally. But many veterans ended up destitute or dependent on family charity. Women who'd run farms or businesses during the war were often expected to hand control back to returning men, even if they'd been managing successfully for years. The brief period of expanded autonomy and responsibility ended. Women went back to having minimal legal rights, no political voice, complete legal subordination to their husbands or fathers. Free Black Americans in the North had slightly more freedom than before the war, as northern states began gradual emancipation. But they faced severe discrimination in employment, housing, and social life. They couldn't vote in most places. They were excluded from many occupations. Even small free Black communities that formed in cities like Philadelphia, Boston, and New York existed in a hostile environment. In the South, slavery was becoming more entrenched. The cotton gin wouldn't be invented until 1793. But even before that, planters were rebuilding their slave-based economy after the war's disruptions. Enslaved people who'd hoped the revolution's rhetoric about liberty might lead to their freedom were mostly disappointed. Some had gained freedom by serving in the army or escaping to the British. Most remained enslaved, and the institution was being strengthened rather than weakened. Native American peoples were dealing with increasing pressure as American settlers pushed westward. The Treaty of Paris had given the United States claim to territory west to the Mississippi River without consulting any of the native peoples who actually lived there. These peoples understandably didn't accept that Britain could just give away their lands. Armed conflicts between settlers and native peoples increased through the 1780s. The Confederation Congress tried to manage this by negotiating treaties with various tribes. But these treaties were often concluded under duress and weren't respected by settlers who just moved where they wanted regardless of what treaties said. The government was too weak to control its own citizens or to protect native peoples from encroachment. Political life was contentious. In many states, there were sharp divisions between different economic and regional interests. Coastal merchants versus inland farmers, creditors versus debtors, those who wanted hard money policies versus those who wanted to print more paper money. States' legislatures became battlegrounds for these conflicts. Some states had relatively democratic constitutions with broad voting rights and powerful legislatures. Others had more restricted voting and stronger executives. Every state was experimenting with how to structure Republican government, and every state was finding it more complicated than expected. The question of what kind of society America should be was being fought out in state legislatures, town meetings, and newspapers. Should it be relatively egalitarian with widespread political participation? Or should it preserve traditional hierarchies with political power concentrated among the wealthy and educated? Should it favor creditors or debtors? Should it encourage manufacturing or remain primarily agricultural? These questions didn't have obvious answers, and different groups had very different interests. Meanwhile, Congress was trying to govern without having the tools to do so effectively. They couldn't even maintain a consistent quorum. Sometimes, there weren't enough delegates present to conduct business. They'd pass resolutions that states ignored. They'd make treaties that they couldn't enforce. They'd try to coordinate economic policy across 13 states that all did whatever they wanted. Foreign governments didn't take the United States seriously. Britain kept troops in forts on American territory in the Great Lakes region, violating the peace treaty because they figured the Americans couldn't do anything about it. Spain controlled the Mississippi River outlet and restricted American trade. The Barbary pirates captured American ships and enslaved American sailors because America had no navy to protect its commerce and no money to pay tribute. American diplomats abroad were frustrated. John Adams was in London trying to negotiate commercial treaties, but the British barely bothered to meet with him. Thomas Jefferson was in Paris and had better luck with the French, but France was dealing with its own financial crisis, partly caused by the enormous debt from supporting America during the Revolution. Nobody was rushing to lend America more money or sign favorable trade deals. The United States in the mid-1780s looked like it might not survive as a unified nation. The states might drift apart into regional confederations. The government might collapse from financial insolvency. Social unrest might tear the country apart. Foreign powers might pick off pieces of American territory. There was a real possibility that the American Revolution would end with the creation of several small, weak nations rather than one strong one. This is the context in which the Constitutional Convention happened. The existing system wasn't working. Something had to change. Different people wanted different changes for different reasons, but there was growing consensus that the status quo was unsustainable. Western expansion and Native American resistance. Let's drift westward for a bit and think about what was happening on the frontier, because that's where some of the most consequential developments were occurring, even if they weren't getting as much attention in Philadelphia or Boston. The Treaty of Paris had given the United States territory extending to the Mississippi River, but giving it on paper and actually controlling it were very different things. This territory was inhabited by native peoples who had their own ideas about who controlled what. The British still had forts in the region and were encouraging native resistance to American expansion. And American settlers were moving west in increasing numbers, regardless of treaties or government policy. The Continental Congress, needing revenue, saw Western lands as a potential source of income. They could survey the land, sell it to settlers and land companies, and use the proceeds to pay down the national debt. This seemed like a good plan, except that it required ignoring the rights of native peoples who were already living there. Congress passed the Land Ordinance of 1785, which established a system for surveying and selling Western lands. The territory would be divided into townships 6 miles square, subdivided into 1 mile square sections of 640 acres each. This was neat and orderly on paper. In reality, it ignored existing settlement patterns, native land claims, and geographic features that didn't fit into a grid. Then, in 1787, Congress passed the Northwest Ordinance, which established how territories could eventually become states. It was actually a fairly enlightened document for its time. It guaranteed freedom of religion, trial by jury, and other rights in the territories. It banned slavery in the Northwest Territory, north of the Ohio River, though not from concern for enslaved people, but because some northern congressmen didn't want to compete with slave labor. And it established a process where territories could eventually become states equal to the original 13. The Northwest Ordinance is often praised as one of the Confederation Congress's major achievements. And in terms of establishing a process for westward expansion and new state formation, it was important. But it was also a blueprint for dispossessing native peoples of their lands in an organized, legal-seeming manner. Various native peoples in the Ohio Valley and Great Lakes region, including Shawnee, Delaware, Miami, Ottawa, and others, had not accepted American claims to their territories. After the Revolution, these peoples increasingly unified in resistance to American expansion. They received support from the British in Canada, who supplied them with weapons and encouraged their resistance as a way to limit American power. Through the mid and late 1780s, there was ongoing warfare on the frontier. American settlers moved into native territories, built cabins, cleared land, started farms. Native war parties attacked settlements, killed settlers, burned cabins. American militia launched retaliatory raids on native villages. It was brutal, small-scale conflict that got little attention in Eastern newspapers, but shaped the lives of thousands of people. The Confederation government tried to negotiate treaties. In 1784, 1785, and 1786, they concluded treaties with various native peoples at Fort Stanwix, Fort McIntosh, and Fort Finney. These treaties supposedly ceded large portions of the Ohio Valley to the United States. But the treaties were often negotiated with leaders who didn't have authority to cede land, or signed under threat, or immediately repudiated by other native leaders who hadn't been party to the negotiations. The situation was complicated by the fact that native peoples didn't have unified governance structures that matched Euro-American expectations. A chief might sign a treaty, but that didn't mean all members of his tribe or other tribes in the region would consider themselves bound by it. American negotiators either didn't understand this or chose to ignore it for convenience. From the native perspective, these treaty negotiations were often exercises in bad faith. Americans would demand land cessions as the price of peace. If native leaders refused, Americans would threaten war. If they agreed, American settlers would move in, violate the terms of the treaty, and then Americans would demand more land cessions. There was no scenario in which native peoples retained control of their territories for long. Some native leaders argued for accommodation, for trying to maintain peace and coexist with the expanding American nation. Others argued for resistance, for fighting to preserve their lands and way of life. Both strategies would ultimately fail because the American expansion was relentless, and the government, even when well-intentioned, couldn't or wouldn't control its own citizens. Settlers moved west for various reasons. Some were looking for economic opportunity, land they could own rather than rent. Some were veterans who'd been promised land bounties for their military service. Some were escaping debt or legal troubles in the East. Some were just restless and wanted to try something new. They moved into Kentucky, Tennessee, the Ohio Valley, gradually pushing the frontier westward. They built rough cabins, cleared land for farming, hunted for food. Life was hard. They faced constant danger from conflict with native peoples. They had minimal government services or legal institutions. They were largely on their own, far from the established settlements in the East. These frontier settlers developed a particular culture and mindset. They were independent, suspicious of government authority, heavily armed, prone to taking matters into their own hands. They'd become an important political force in the early American Republic. But in the 1780s, they were mostly just trying to survive and claim land they believed was theirs for the taking. The pattern of westward expansion that would define much of American history for the next century was already established in the 1780s. Americans would move into new territories. Native peoples would resist. There would be conflict and treaties, and more conflict. Eventually, native peoples would be dispossessed and forced to move further west or onto reservations. The United States would grow, constantly pushing its boundaries, convinced that this expansion was both inevitable and justified. The Revolution had removed British restrictions on westward expansion. The Treaty of Paris had given the United States claim to enormous territories. The Northwest Ordinance had established a process for organizing and governing those territories. And thousands of American settlers were already moving west, creating facts on the ground that would be hard to reverse regardless of treaties or government policy. For Native Americans, the American Revolution was the beginning of a catastrophe that would unfold over the next century. The new United States would prove far more threatening to native peoples than Britain had been. The principles of liberty and self-determination that Americans had fought for didn't extend to native peoples, who were seen as obstacles to American expansion, rather than as peoples with their own rights to their lands. But in the 1780s, this was all still developing. The full scope of what American expansion would mean wasn't yet clear. Native peoples in the Ohio Valley were still resisting, still fighting for their territories, still hoping they could maintain some control over their lands and lives. That hope would be gradually crushed over the following decades, but it hadn't been extinguished yet. The fate of the Loyalists, we should spend some time thinking about what happened to the Loyalists, because their story is part of the Revolution too, even though it's often overlooked. During the war, somewhere between 15% and 20% of the colonial population remained loyal to Britain. That's a substantial minority, maybe 500,000 people or more. They had various reasons for their loyalty. Some genuinely believed in monarchy and British authority. Some had economic ties to Britain. Some were royal officials or Anglican clergy. Some were recent immigrants who still identified as British. Some just distrusted the Patriot leadership or feared the social upheaval that revolution might bring. Life had been difficult for Loyalists during the war. In areas controlled by Patriots, Loyalists faced harassment, property confiscation, and sometimes violence. They were excluded from political participation, sometimes imprisoned, occasionally tarred and feathered. Loyalist militias fought for the British, and when patriots recaptured areas, they often took revenge on Loyalist families. Some Loyalists fled to British-controlled cities like New York, Charleston, or Savannah for protection. Others tried to keep their heads down and avoid attracting attention from either side. Some fought in Loyalist military units. Others tried to remain neutral, which satisfied no one. After Yorktown, Loyalists in American-controlled areas had to decide what to do. Some hoped they could reconcile with their patriot neighbors and be accepted in the new nation. Some prepared to flee. Some waited to see what the peace treaty would say. The Treaty of Paris included provisions about Loyalists, but they were weak. Congress agreed to earnestly recommend that states restore confiscated Loyalist property and not prosecute Loyalists further for their wartime activities. This recommendation was largely ignored. States passed laws explicitly refusing to restore Loyalist property. Some allowed prosecution of Loyalists for treason or other crimes. As British forces evacuated American cities in 1782 and 1783, thousands of Loyalists evacuated with them. From Savannah, Charleston, and New York, Loyalists boarded ships carrying whatever possessions they could manage, leaving behind homes, businesses, land, friends, and sometimes family members. About 60,000 to 100,000 Loyalists left America during and after the Revolution. Many went to Canada, particularly Nova Scotia and Quebec, where the British government provided land grants and some financial support. Others went to Britain itself, though they often found themselves unwelcome there, seen as failures who'd lost America. Some went to the Caribbean or to British territories in Africa or India. The Loyalist exodus to Canada was particularly significant. About 30,000 to 40,000 Loyalists settled in Nova Scotia alone, doubling its population almost overnight. They established new communities, brought American customs and expectations, and shaped Canadian development. Many were unhappy with their new circumstances, having left behind established lives for uncertain futures in cold, undeveloped territories. But they made the best of it. Black Loyalists faced particular challenges. About 3,000 to 4,000 formerly enslaved people who'd escaped to British lines and been promised freedom were evacuated to Nova Scotia. They faced discrimination from white Loyalists, were given poor land, and struggled economically. Many eventually left Nova Scotia for Sierra Leone in Africa, hoping to build a new life there. That experiment had its own difficulties, but some established communities that survive to this day. Loyalists who stayed in America faced varying treatment depending on where they lived and how prominent their loyalty had been. Some integrated back into their communities, especially if they'd kept a low profile during the war. Others faced ongoing harassment and discrimination. Some had their property permanently confiscated. Others managed to quietly retain or regain their property. The confiscation and sale of Loyalist property was one way states tried to manage their war debts and reward patriots. Loyalist estates were seized, sold at auction, and the proceeds used for state purposes. This amounted to a significant redistribution of property, though most confiscated estates went to wealthy patriots rather than to ordinary soldiers or poor families. Some prominent loyalists who stayed faced prosecution. A few were executed for treason, though this was relatively rare. More common were fines, property confiscation, and being barred from public office or voting. States passed laws restricting loyalists' rights, though these were gradually relaxed over the years. The Revolution had been a civil war as well as a war for independence, and like all civil wars, it left bitter divisions. Communities and families had split. Neighbors had betrayed neighbors. Old friendships had ended. These wounds took generations to heal, if they ever fully did. Some loyalists who'd fled eventually returned, either officially pardoned or just sneaking back and hoping no one would prosecute them. Some resumed their old lives with varying degrees of success. Others found themselves permanently alienated from communities they'd once been part of. The treatment of loyalists is one of the morally complicated aspects of the Revolution. From the patriot perspective, loyalists were traitors who'd sided with tyranny and deserved punishment. From the loyalist perspective, they'd remained loyal to legitimate authority and were being persecuted for it. Both sides had grievances, and both sides had committed acts they probably weren't proud of. The fact that 15–20% of the population had opposed independence is also a reminder that the revolution wasn't universally supported. The narrative of unanimous American resistance to British tyranny doesn't match reality. A large minority wanted to remain British, and many others were ambivalent or just wanted to be left alone. The Patriots won, so they got to write the history, but the Loyalists' perspective is part of the story too. By the 1790s, the Loyalist issue was fading. States gradually relaxed restrictions. Loyalists who'd left were mostly not coming back. The new nation was consolidating, and dwelling on old divisions wasn't productive. But the Loyalist exodus had reshaped North America, strengthening British Canada and redistributing property in the United States. The Revolution's victory had come partly through driving out a significant portion of the population that opposed it. The Constitution and the Revolution's real ending. So we've drifted our way through the war and into the messy aftermath. And now we're approaching what might be considered the Revolution's real conclusion, the writing and ratification of the Constitution. Because you could argue that the Revolution wasn't complete until Americans established a functioning government capable of actually running the country they'd fought to create. The Constitutional Convention met in Philadelphia in May 1787. The delegates were supposed to revise the Articles of Confederation. Instead, they spent the summer writing an entirely new constitution, meeting in secret so they could debate freely without public pressure. The delegates disagreed about almost everything. How should representation in Congress be determined? Should all states have equal representation, Or should larger states have more? How should the executive be structured? How much power should the national government have versus the states? Should slavery be protected or prohibited? How much democracy was appropriate? The final Constitution was full of compromises. Congress would have 2 houses, with representation in the House based on population and equal representation in the Senate. The president would be elected indirectly through an electoral college. The national government would have enumerated powers, with other powers reserved to the states. Slavery wouldn't be mentioned by name, but enslaved people would count as 3/5 of a person for purposes of determining representation, and the slave trade couldn't be banned before 1808. The 3/5 compromise is particularly disturbing in hindsight. It gave Southern states more representation in Congress, and the Electoral College based on their enslaved populations, who of course had no rights and couldn't vote. It was a pragmatic political compromise that embedded slavery's protection into the Constitution, while allowing Northerners to pretend they hadn't explicitly endorsed it. The Constitution was finished in September 1787 and sent to the states for ratification. It needed approval from 9 of the 13 states to go into effect. What followed was an intense national debate about whether to adopt the new Constitution. Supporters, who called themselves Federalists, argued that the Constitution was necessary to create an effective national government. Without it, they said, the nation would collapse into chaos. Foreign powers would exploit American weakness, and the Revolution's achievements would be lost. Hamilton, Madison, and Jay wrote a series of essays, later collected as the Federalist Papers, making the case for ratification. Opponents, called anti-federalists, worried that the Constitution gave too much power to the national government and threatened liberty. They wanted a Bill of Rights, explicitly protecting individual freedoms. They feared that the presidency would become a monarchy. They worried that a powerful national government would be controlled by wealthy elites at the expense of ordinary people. They thought state governments should retain more power. The debate was serious and substantive. Both sides raised legitimate concerns. The Federalists were right that the Confederation government was too weak to function effectively. The anti-Federalists were right that the Constitution lacked explicit protections for individual rights and could potentially be used to consolidate power in ways that threatened liberty. State ratifying conventions debated intensely. Delaware ratified quickly in December 1787. Pennsylvania and New Jersey followed. In Massachusetts, the convention was closely divided until Federalists agreed to recommend amendments protecting individual rights. This broke the logjam. Massachusetts ratified in February 1788 with recommended amendments. Other states followed the same pattern, ratifying while recommending amendments. By June 1788, 9 states had ratified, which was enough for the Constitution to go into effect. But New York and Virginia, the largest and most important states, hadn't ratified yet. Without them, the new nation would be crippled. Both states had strong anti-federalist movements and close votes, but both eventually ratified, Virginia in June and New York in July, both with recommended amendments. North Carolina and Rhode Island held out longer. North Carolina ratified in November 1789, and Rhode Island, being Rhode Island and contrary to the end, didn't ratify until May 1790. By then, the new government was already operating, and it was clear they'd be left behind if they didn't join. The first Congress under the Constitution met in March 1789. George Washington was elected as the first president, receiving every electoral vote. He was inaugurated in April in New York, the temporary capital. The government was officially operational. Washington's acceptance of the presidency was significant. He'd retired after the war, voluntarily given up power, and seemed genuinely happy at Mount Vernon. But he believed the nation needed him, and he felt obligated to serve. His willingness to come back and his careful approach to defining the presidency helped establish important precedents. The first Congress's major achievement was drafting and proposing the Bill of Rights, the first 10 amendments to the Constitution. James Madison, now a congressman, took the lead in drafting amendments addressing anti-federalist concerns. These protected freedom of speech, religion, the press, and assembly, the right to bear arms, protections against unreasonable search and seizure, rights of the accused, protection against self-incrimination, jury trial rights, and a statement that powers not delegated to the federal government were reserved to the states and the people. The Bill of Rights was proposed in September 1789 and ratified by the required 3/4 of states by December 1791. With its ratification, you could argue that the American Revolution was finally complete. Americans had fought for independence, won it, established a stable government with protections for individual rights, and set the new nation on a path forward. Except, of course, it wasn't complete. The Constitution and Bill of Rights left slavery untouched. Women still had minimal rights. Native Americans were explicitly excluded from the political community. Poor people in many states still couldn't vote. The revolution had created a framework, but the work of actually building a just and equal society was far from finished. That work continues even today. Reflections and conclusion. So here we are finally, at the end of this very long journey through the American Revolution. We've covered the fighting, the politics, the diplomacy, the social upheaval, the aftermath, and the establishment of the Constitution. We've looked at famous figures and ordinary people, victories and defeats, principles and compromises. What does it all add up to? That's a question Americans have been arguing about for 2.5 centuries. The revolution achieved independence, which was no small thing. 13 colonies successfully broke away from one of the world's most powerful empires. That was historically unusual and significant. It showed that colonial peoples could successfully rebel and establish their own nations. The revolution established the principle that governments derive their legitimacy from the consent of the governed. This was radical in a world where most governments were monarchies claiming authority from divine right or tradition. The idea that ordinary people had the right to determine who governed them and how was transformative. The revolution created a republic in an era of monarchies. The United States was an experiment in whether a large republic could actually work. Classical political theory suggested that republics could only function in small, homogeneous societies. The American Republic was continental in scale and diverse in its population. Whether it would survive was genuinely uncertain. The revolution inspired other independence movements and democratic revolutions. The French Revolution drew heavily on American example. Latin American independence movements in the 19th century looked to the American Revolution as a model. Anti-colonial movements in the 20th century invoked the revolution's principles. The idea that people had the right to self-determination became a powerful force in global politics. But the revolution also failed to address or resolve fundamental contradictions. The most obvious was slavery. The revolution's rhetoric about liberty and equality was deeply hypocritical, while slavery continued. The founders knew this. Some were troubled by it, but they prioritized creating a unified nation over confronting slavery, storing up a crisis that would explode in civil war 80 years later. The revolution didn't extend political rights to women. The discourse about rights and citizenship was explicitly gendered as male. Women were excluded from political participation and had minimal legal rights. It would take another century and a half before women gained full citizenship rights. The revolution was catastrophic for Native Americans. The removal of British restrictions on westward expansion and the new nation's land hunger led to escalating dispossession and violence. Native peoples would spend the next century fighting a losing battle to preserve their lands and autonomy. The revolution created a nation where wealth and class continued to matter enormously. Despite rhetoric about equality, the wealthy elite largely retained their social and economic dominance. The Constitution was written partly to protect property rights and limit excessive democracy. The revolution didn't create a leveling society where everyone had equal opportunity. So, was the revolution a success or a failure? It depends on your perspective and what you're measuring. If you measure by whether Americans achieved independence and established a functioning Republican government, it was a success. The United States survived, grew, became powerful and influential. The Constitution has lasted over 230 years, making it one of the oldest written constitutions still in use. If you measure by whether the revolution lived up to its own stated principles of liberty and equality for all, it was at best a partial success. The principles were established, but their application was limited and contested. Later generations would have to fight to expand who counted as deserving of those rights and what those rights actually meant. If you measure by the human cost, it's more complicated. Thousands died, families were divided, communities were destroyed, Loyalists were driven from their homes. Native peoples lost their lands. Enslaved people mostly saw the revolution as a missed opportunity. Was independence worth all that suffering? For the people who benefited, probably yes. For those who lost, probably not. The American Revolution is one of those historical events that's large enough and complex enough that different people can draw very different lessons from it. You can see it as a triumph of liberty over tyranny. You can see it as a conservative movement by colonial elites to preserve their privileges. You can see it as a tragic failure to extend revolutionary principles to everyone. You can see it as the beginning of American expansionism and imperialism. All of these perspectives have some truth to them. What's clear is that the revolution was a beginning, not an ending. It established a framework and a set of principles, but it left enormous work undone. The creation of a more perfect union, to use the Constitution's phrase, would be the work of generations. Americans would spend the next 2 centuries arguing about what the revolution meant, who it was for, and what obligations it created. Slavery would eventually be abolished, but only after a devastating civil war. Women would eventually gain voting rights, but only after decades of activism and protest. Civil rights for Black Americans would be secured, at least legally, but only after another century of struggle. Native American rights would be slowly, partially recognized after immense suffering and loss. LGBTQ rights, disability rights, labor rights, all would require separate movements and battles. The revolution created possibilities, but realizing those possibilities required continued struggle. The principles that all people are created equal, that they're endowed with unalienable rights, that governments should protect those rights and derive their authority from the consent of the governed. These were powerful ideas. But they were just ideas until people fought to make them real. And that work continues. The American Revolution isn't a completed event safely in the past. It's an ongoing project, an unfinished revolution. Every generation has to decide what those founding principles actually mean and how to apply them to new circumstances and new questions. Every generation has to choose whether to expand the circle of who counts as deserving of rights and freedom, or whether to restrict it. So the American Revolution matters not just as history, but as a living argument about what America should be. The revolutionaries of 1776 couldn't have imagined what the nation they created would become. They'd probably be surprised by much of it, shocked by some of it, maybe pleased by other parts. But what they did create was a framework flexible enough to accommodate change and growth, principles powerful enough to inspire continued struggle for justice and equality. And on that note, after more than 20,000 words, we can finally rest. The American Revolution happened. Independence was won. A nation was created. The work of building a more perfect union began. That work continues today, which means in some sense the revolution never really ended. But the part we set out to explore, from the first shots at Lexington in 1775, through the ratification of the Bill of Rights in 1791, that that part of the story is complete. Sleep well. Dream of a nation being born, messily and painfully, imperfectly, but hopefully, out of revolution and compromise and vision and contradiction. The revolution happened. America began. And centuries later, we're still figuring out what that means. Thank you for staying with me through this marathon journey. The American Revolution was complicated, messy, sometimes inspiring, sometimes disturbing, always human. It created possibilities and foreclosed others. It established principles that would matter far beyond America's borders. And it left work unfinished that continues today. But for now, the story is told. Rest easy. The revolution is over, and the nation endures.